My friend Clara and her family actually abandoned their 3-story townhouse in Charleston suddenly back in 2008. Her mother was a total stoic who treated every structural anomaly like a minor maintenance issue. For instance, if a heavy oak cupboard door unlatched itself and swung open against the wall, it was an unlevel hinge. If the hallway smelled like wet iron and old well water, it was just the city's coastal storm drains backing up through the foundations. Looking back, her mum was clearly running an exhausting daily campaign of damage control just to keep Clara and her younger sister from packing their own bags and sleeping on the sidewalk. Clara was 10 at the time, sharing a massive drafty corner room with her sister, Lily. Because the house had this freezing, high-ceilinged density to it, the kind of cold that seemed to radiate outward from the plaster rather than the windows, they had a strict habit of leaving the bedroom door wide open so that they could see the pale yellow glow of the safety light plugged into the baseboard by the top of the stairs. Now, one night, Clara woke up because she felt an immense suffocating weight pressuring down on the mattress right next to her hip. The air in the room had gone completely still and completely cold as well. Then, she heard somebody breathing, but with lungs full of fluid is what she said. A shallow breath that sounded like somebody was drowning. Clara shifted on the mattress, turning over to tell Lily to move back over to her own side of the bed. But when her eyes adjusted, she realized that the other side of the mattress was completely empty. You see, she had assumed that it was Lily at first, but Lily wasn't even in the room. She had snuck downstairs hours earlier with her pillow to sleep on the living room sofa because her throat was sore and the noise from the walls was keeping her awake, is what she said. The indentation on the edge of the mattress, it wasn't a person. The fabric and the foam were simply compressed down 6 inches, forming a deep and narrow hollow right next to Clara's legs, as if an invisible 90-pound iron weight was resting perfectly balanced to the springs. As she stared at the empty sheets, the fabric inside the indentation slowly shifted, twisting slightly as if whatever was sinking into the bed was turning its weight around to face her. Clara, she didn't scream because her throat completely locked up all of a sudden. She scrambled backward out of the covers, her bare feet hitting the old pine floorboards, and sprinted out onto the dark landing toward her parents' room at the other end of the corridor. Right as her heels hit the carpet, though, she hit something damp. There was a small square of carpet that was now completely wet. Now, in her room was a small square attic access panel in the ceiling, a heavy piece of solid waterlogged plywood that required a step stool and actual physical force to lift it. And as she was running, she heard something come from there, so she looked up, and it didn't drop down, but it was raised into the crawl space by about an inch, and then a sound came down through the dark square opening. She said that it sounded like someone scurrying around the opening there with 1,000 little legs just round and round that hole. As she ran out of there too, the sound, it didn't stay in the ceiling. It tracked her progress along the hallway, moving directly over her head at the exact same speed that she was running. But when she stopped outside of her parents' doorframe, this sound in the ceiling stopped perfectly above her head, and a long thin bead of thick grayish fluid dripped through the ceiling and landed with a soft splat on the damp carpet right between her big toes. Upon seeing that, she jammed her shoulder into her parents' door, woke them up crying, and spent the rest of the night squeezed between them, staring at the bottom of their bedroom door. The next morning, her dad went up into the attic ladder with a flashlight, expecting to find a dead raccoon or a stray tomcat that had slipped through the old roof tiles. He looked around, and the blow-in insulation was completely undisturbed. There were no animal droppings, no tracks, and no leaks in the roof. But right above the spot on the landing where Clara had frozen, someone had taken 3 old black iron square head nails from a rusty jar in the cellar and literally driven them deep into the main structural joist. They weren't hammered in all the way, which is how he noticed, lined up in a perfect vertical row, and from the bottom nail, there was a tiny, neatly folded square of old newspaper from 1941 or something, containing nothing but the obituary section. Well, her family broke the lease 3 weeks later, leaving behind half their curtains and a set of heavy pine wardrobes because her dad didn't want to spend another night packing inside the house. The official story that they told the neighbors was that the dampness was messing with Lily's lungs, but Clara told me that she actually ran into one of the subsequent tenants at a university dinner years later just out of sheer luck. The girl didn't know Clara had ever lived there at first, but she mentioned that she had stopped using the upper floor entirely within months of moving in. She was hesitant to say anything more than this, but eventually she said that she would wake up in the morning and find her cat sitting at the very bottom of the stairs, its back arched, staring up at the dark ceiling panel, and growling with a low rattling sound in his chest until its gums bled, refusing to step foot onto the second floor carpet, no matter how much food she put out for it. Apparently, they eventually left too because of all this stuff, and another family moved in. The dust in the living room hadn't settled horizontally. It was clinging to the vertical surfaces of the walls in long grey velvet strips. That was the first detail that made my old co-worker, Marcus, realize that his new place in Richmond wasn't just old, it was structurally wrong. He just signed a lease on a small detached brick house down near the rail yards, a place that sat completely empty for 10 hours every single night while he worked the graveyard shift as a diesel mechanic. So, he didn't notice anything at first, but he would come home eventually at 5 in the morning, unlock the front door and step into the apartment that felt completely pressurized, like the air inside of a car that had been sitting in the sun with the windows rolled up for days, is what he said. But the digital thermostat on the wall always read exactly 68 degrees. But then came the salt. So Marcus kept a standard glass shaker on the small laminate counter by his sink, and one afternoon he woke up at around 3, walked out to make a coffee, and found a neat solid white bar of table salt poured directly across the threshold of his bedroom door. It wasn't spilled or scattered in a rush or anything too. It was a perfect, dense line, exactly an inch wide, stretching flawlessly from one side of the wooden casing to the other. Because his sleep schedule was completely trashed from the night shifts, he figured that his own brain was just misfiring. He assumed that he was sleepwalking, doing weird repetitive tasks in his sleep without logging the memory. To prove it to himself too, he bought a cheap motion-active webcam, set it on top of the refrigerator, and angled the lens straight down the short hallway that connected the kitchen to his bedroom. For 2 weeks as well, the memory card showed absolutely nothing, just hours of a dark, narrow corridor bathed in the digital green light of the stove clock. Marcus eventually drove down to Norfolk for a 4-day weekend to see his family. He locked the windows, checked the deadbolts twice, and kept his phone on the seat next to him, expecting the camera app to ping him if a stray cat or a pipe movement triggered the sensor or something. The phone stayed completely silent the entire trip, though. He pulled back into his driveway on a wet morning, and before he could even cut the engine, his next-door neighbor, a retired nurse who spent most of her day watching the street from her porch, walked straight down her steps and met him at his car door. She asked him why his friend spent the weekend standing on the roof. Marcus dropped his keys onto the floor mat. He told her that the house was empty, that he'd been gone since Thursday. The woman, she didn't blink though. She said that on Saturday night, around 10 o'clock, she looked out her kitchen window because the security light between their houses had gone dark. In the moonlight, she apparently saw a man standing on the flat tin roof of Marcus's rear porch extension. He wasn't prying at the roof or anything, or seemed to be looking for an open window or something. He was just standing completely upright, his torso bent forward in a rigid, unnatural 45-degree angle, staring down into the dark grass of the yard. She watched him stay in that exact unmoving lean for about 40 minutes apparently, until she got too uncomfortable to keep looking. Upon hearing that, Marcus let himself inside the house with his pocket knife out. He went straight for the webcam on the refrigerator to pull the SD card. The video file for Saturday night, it wasn't missing or corrupted or anything. The timestamp in the bottom right corner was ticking forward in perfect real-time seconds, but the actual image of the hallway was completely gone. The entire screen was filled with a solid, unchanging block of heavy grey static that started at exactly 10 p.m. and stayed on the screen until the sun broke through the kitchen windows at dawn, when the normal camera feed instantly snapped back into focus. He really didn't know what to make of this at the time, but eventually he moved out because the space was just too much for him, is what he said. He actually hired 2 guys from a gas station down the road to empty the house while he stood on the sidewalk, which to me says that there's more going on there than he's admitting. I still talk to him from time to time, but he doesn't like talking about that house, and so I just try to leave it alone. I've worked as a night shift custodial lead for a regional hospital in Montana for 12 years now. It's a massive complex, a labyrinth of white-tiled corridors, sterile supply rooms, and administrative wings that get locked down after 9 p.m. I'm the one who handles the final sweep of the West Wing, the palliative care ward. Last Tuesday, at 4:15, I was making my rounds near room 402, an end of a hall unit that had been vacant since the previous weekend. I reached the door, pushed it open to check the vitals monitor, and ensure that the lights were extinguished, as per protocol. Inside, a patient was sitting in the recliner. He was wearing the standard hospital gown, hunched over, his hands resting on his knees. I immediately felt the tension drop in my gut. I apologized, assuming it was a late transfer or maybe a mix-up with the admissions, and asked for his name so that I could clear it with the night nurse station. The patient didn't respond, though. He stayed in that hunched position, his breathing shallow. I moved closer, ready to repeat myself, when I noticed something off about his silhouette against the window. The light from the street lamp outside passed directly through his shoulders. Now, not through a gap, but through the mass of his body. It looked like a projection almost, slightly defocused, the edges of his gown fraying into the static of the room's ambient shadows. I stepped back, my radio passed to my mouth, and I called for the head nurse. I kept my eyes on him, certain that I was witnessing an unauthorized patient or a serious lapse in security. By the time that the head nurse and the 2 orderlies arrived, the room, it was empty. We checked the security footage from the hallway camera covering room 402. The file for the last 3 hours showed a single, continuous, unobstructed view of the hallway. No one entered room 402, and nobody exited. The door, it had remained locked, as verified by the digital access log. The head nurse sort of looked at the timestamp, then at me a few times, and she reminded me that room 402 had been empty since Saturday following a death. She suggested that I take a leave of absence to deal with the fatigue. I didn't take the leave in the end. I stayed on my shift, but every night when I reach the door to room 402, I really don't want to go inside. I stare at the heavy plastic handle, knowing that the record says the room is empty, and I remember exactly what I saw, sitting in that chair, ignoring the light passing through its frame. These days, I don't report things like that anymore. Instead, I just choose to lock the door from the outside and just sort of keep walking. I don't think anyone ever really settles into a place like the old O'Malley estate. People say it has character, which really is just a polite shorthand for drafty, decaying, and fundamentally wrong. But I took the lease 3 years ago because the rent was absurdly low for a property like this, nestled against the foothills where the urban sprawl finally gives up to the cedar forests. It's a traditional sort of style home as well, and lots of dark polished wood, paper screens, and a deep enclosed garden that never seems to catch the sun. For the first 30 months, the house was just a house, really. It was quiet, sure, but honestly, I kind of liked the quiet. I I was working remotely as a technical consultant too, and the solitude was exactly what I needed to finish my certification. But the shift, that happened on a Tuesday, late in October. So I was cleaning the storage room behind the kitchen, a space that I rarely entered because it was so crammed with previous tenants' discarded shelving and broken garden tools and whatnot. But I was moving a heavy rack of shelving when I sort of realized the floorboards were a bit uneven. Not just sagging too, they were actually displaced. So I pulled them up, thinking that there might be a moisture issue, and found a cavity beneath the foundation. It wasn't a crawl space exactly, but it was a perfectly square pit lined with weathered grey slate. Inside sat a single iron tea kettle, scorched black, and a stack of business cards, all of them blank, save for a series of pinprick holes that formed an intricate geometric pattern. I didn't touch the kettle, I just settled the floorboards back into their place, feeling an immediate sharp drop in the temperature of the room. Honestly, it felt as if I had just opened a freezer all of a sudden. That night, that's when the pattern started. So I was reading in the study when I saw the first one. It was a flicker of a shadow against the screen. Not a human silhouette, but a distortion of the light, like a heat haze trapped in a confined space. It passed across the paper screen in one fluid mechanical motion, and then all of a sudden, it was gone. I walked over to the screen, but there was nothing in the hallway, just the hum of the cooling fan from my laptop and the distant muffled sound of the wind through the cedar trees. By the end of the week, the visual disturbances were no longer peripheral, though. I was sitting at my desk when the screen of my monitor flickered, the display washing out into a dark negative white. When it recovered, the desktop icons had been rearranged into the same grid that I think that I had seen on those business cards. I did check this too, and it did seem like that. My mouse cursor started moving on its own at one point, dragging files into a folder that I hadn't even created, naming it with a string of symbols that looked like broken machine code. I shut the computer down thinking that I'd been hacked, but the screen, it stayed lit while I had pushed it down. I actually had to pull the power cable from the wall to finally get it to die. And then came the physical manifestations. So I started waking up at around 3 in the morning every night, without fail. I'd be lying there, staring at the ceiling, and I'd feel the mattress sort of, sink beside me, as if somebody had just sat down on it. The pressure was always localized, firm and heavy. I would reach out expecting to feel fabric or skin, but I'd hit nothing but empty, sort of static charged air, is what I guess you could say. The room would grow impossibly cold though, just like before, and I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that it must be carbon monoxide or structural settling, or maybe just the stress of working 60 hours a week. I even went so far as to buy a professional-grade EMF meter and a thermal camera, desperate to put a number or maybe a shape to what was happening. The thermal camera, though, that was the worst. So one night, I set it up facing the hallway, and I didn't see a person, but I saw what was really just a void. It appeared as a cold spot on the screen, a perfect absolute zero where the ambient heat of the hallway should have been. It moved with a jittery frame-by-frame cadence, crossing the field of vision in what looked like 60 distinct jumps per second. It didn't walk or anything, it just sort of vanished from one point and then occupied the next, erasing the space in between. My partner, Kale, started to notice this too. She didn't see the void, but she experienced the environment sometimes. She would be in the kitchen and the tea would boil over, the pot scorching the stovetop, while the internal temperature of the water remained cold enough to form ice crystals almost. She started carrying a notebook, writing down every time an object moved or a light flickered. She filled 3 notebooks in 4 days too. The turning point though, that was the incident in the attic. So, we were trying to seal off the crawl space at one point, thinking that maybe a wild animal had gotten into the walls and was somehow projecting these strange, chaotic triggers. Kale climbed the ladder, holding a flashlight. She didn't scream, but she dropped the light and it hit the floorboards with a dull thud, and she scrambled backward, falling off the ladder and into my arms, literally. She wouldn't look up, too. She kept pointing at the ceiling, her breath hitching in her chest as she was in panic. When I shone my light into the rafters, I didn't see an animal. I saw the ceiling, and it was covered in hundreds of tiny hand-carved wooden pegs, all driven into the timber at precise geometric intervals. And hanging from the center of the pegs was like a web of hair-thin wire, forming the same grid that I'd seen in the basement, in the monitor and on the business cards. It seemed to be maybe like a map of the house or a map of the garden or something. Whatever the case, we literally moved out the next morning after this. We didn't even pack the furniture in the end. We just took our clothes and the hard drives and we left the keys on the counter. We didn't even inform the landlord, and we didn't wait for the security deposit either. But the final confirmation, that actually came 3 days later. So I went back to pick up a box of files that I'd forgotten in the study. I had a spare key, but as I approached the door, I saw the wood was sort of scorched almost, and there was this faint sort of burnt hair smell too. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was empty, but there was this sort of, I don't know, weird echoing through the entire house now. I didn't go into the study. I turned around and I just walked out to the car because I'd had enough of dealing with this. But as I was pulling away, I looked up at the attic window. It was wide open, and standing there, looking down at the empty driveway, was a shape, a silhouette that didn't reflect light, and a void in the shape of a man, really. I could only just see it too, because it sort of blended into the blackness behind it, but it seemed to be watching us leave with the same mechanical frame-by-frame stillness that I had noticed on the void. I didn't say anything to Kale, but upon seeing it, I hightailed it out of there. I'm in a high-rise apartment now, and it's all glass and steel, 10 floors up with no attic and no crawl space. The rent is double, which is unfortunate, and the commute is an absolute nightmare, but hey, at least I sleep through the night now. And for the first time in years, the air in my bedroom feels like air again, nothing else. It took me a while too, but I eventually stopped looking for patterns, and I've stopped looking for reasons too. I've been trying to figure out how to put this into words for weeks now, but honestly, even typing it out feels like I'm just asking for trouble. My brother thinks that I hit my head or had some kind of a state that I was in, but he wasn't there and he didn't see what was sitting on the edge of the bed. It was mid-August 3 years ago, and I was working nights at a warehouse in Lyon, doing the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. My apartment, it was one of those cramped pre-war studios with high ceilings and a radiator that rattled like a dying engine. I'd gotten home, showered, and crashed around 7 in the morning. Total blackout. Eventually I woke up, but I wasn't really awake. You sort of know that state where you're conscious, but your limbs feel like they're sort of buried under sandbags? Well, that's what this was. My face was pressed into the pillow as well, staring at the gap between the box spring and the floor. The room was dead silent. Not the usual city noise that I was used to. No sirens, no muffled chatter from the street, no hum on the fridge. Just a thick, pressurized stillness. And then I felt the bed shift. It wasn't a bounce or a jolt. It was a slow and deliberate depression of someone heavy sitting down on the edge of the mattress. I tried to lift my head at that point, but for some reason I just couldn't. I couldn't even twitch a finger. My brain was firing, telling me to jump up, but my body was completely unresponsive. And then I heard something. It wasn't a voice, but it was like the sound of 2 jagged pieces of glass being rubbed together in a sort of pattern. It was coming from right next to my left ear as well. Again, it wasn't speaking or it didn't have a language or anything, but for some reason, I sort of perceived that the cadence was of a question. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, a sharp sort of crystalline scraping sound. I couldn't move, but I could force my eyes to roll toward the side of the bed. And there, standing there, wasn't a person. It was darker than the shadows around it, framed by a faint static-like shimmer in the air. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the room almost, and I didn't see features, just that pulsating jagged outline. The scraping sound, though, stopped abruptly. Then the weight on the mattress lifted, the pressure in the room snapped back to normal, the fridge seemed to hum back to life, a distant car horn blared, and I literally gasped in a lungful of air all of a sudden, finally able to throw myself backward against the headboard. When I did, the room was empty. The door was still locked from the inside. I sat there for at least 2 hours just staring at that wall, waiting for the sun to hit the floorboards. I don't know what that was, and I've read enough online to know about sleep paralysis and to know that it's supposed to be hallucinatory, brains misfiring or whatever, but those explanations, they don't really account for the way that the air was in the room that day, or why the silence was so absolute that it felt like the house had been plucked out of a neighborhood entirely. I eventually moved out of that apartment 2 months later, and I haven't experienced anything since then, or before that, related to this. I really don't talk about the valley much, mainly because I got lost doesn't even come close to what happened out there, and nobody wants to hear about the geometry of the thing too. My old man still swears that it was just bad mapping and a lack of sunlight. This was about 4 years back, and I was doing some contract surveying work in a remote stretch of the Peruvian Andes. We were tracking a specific migration pattern, or at least that was the objective. I'd gone out alone that day to get up a sensor array near a limestone ridge that hadn't been documented on our older topographic charts. I reached the ridge at around 4 p.m. The air was pretty thin up there, and I remember checking my watch because I wanted to be clear of the scree slope before the light failed. I turned around to head back, but suddenly the path that I'd taken, the one that I'd been walking for like 2 hours, just wasn't there. Let me be clear too that it wasn't like blocked or anything, and it wasn't obscured by anything. I mean, there was really nothing there to do that with. It just wasn't part of the terrain anymore all of a sudden. I stood there for a second, trying to reset my perspective and figure out what I was looking at. I looked down at the GPS, and the screen was just flickering a dull, flat grey, not searching for satellites, and it was just sort of blank. Then, all of a sudden, everything just went dead quiet. It was like the world had suddenly gone on mute. Every footfall that I took on the loose rock was just dead silent. I even dropped my water bottle by accident in the shock, and it didn't clatter against the stone. It just sort of hit the ground and made no sound at all. I looked up, and about 50 yards away, the rocks seemed to be folding over and in on themselves. Not shifting like under an avalanche or anything, but sort of bending inward is the best way that I can describe it. I watched a jagged boulder sort of sprout a shadow that moved against the direction of the sun. It was as if the physical laws governing the ridge had been swapped out for something entirely different. Then I heard something behind me. It sounded like something was hitting a tree just over and over again with like a huge log or a pipe or something. I didn't turn around. I started walking in what I prayed was the right direction, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon. I walked for what felt like hours too, even though the sun hadn't moved an inch from its position in the sky. My heart was racing, but my breath wasn't coming out as mist anymore. The air had gone completely still, and I don't know how long I was on that stretch of empty space, but the next thing that I remember, I was stumbling into the base camp, miles away from the ridge. My clothes were covered in a fine white powder that I had never seen before, and my watch had stopped at 4:12 p.m. The GPS unit was fried and the internal casing had literally melted, like it had been held over a blowtorch. When I told the crew, they looked at me like I had had a breakdown from the altitude. They didn't see the powder and they didn't believe the map mismatch at all, so I didn't push it. I packed my gear that night and I left on the first truck the next morning to the city. I've done a lot of hiking since then, but I have never had anything like that happen before or since then. I try not to go anywhere as well that requires me to rely on a map or a GPS anymore. And I don't know what that sound was, the log or the pipe or whatever hitting the tree, but whatever was hitting it, it sounded absolutely massive. So I worked as a night shift data entry clerk at a medical logistics facility on the outskirts of Sendai, Japan. The facility was a 3-story concrete structure, and my workspace was a windowless cubicle located in the back corner of the 3rd floor. The floor layout consisted of a central hallway with rows of cubicles on either side, terminating at a reinforced steel fire exit. It was about 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. The building's central ventilation system had been shut down for scheduled maintenance, which removed the constant low frequency of the air handlers. It was pretty quiet there that night, and my task was to manually cross-reference shipping manifests from a physical ledger, entering data into a terminal. I stopped typing to reach for a glass of water at one point on the side of my desk. That's when I noticed the shadow on the floor. It was cast against the base of my cubicle wall, directly in my peripheral vision. The shadow, it belonged to someone standing in the doorway of the office area, facing into the room. Because the overhead fluorescent lights in the hallway were active, the shadow was pretty sharp and high contrast, clearly defined against the beige linoleum. It depicted a person standing with their arms held perfectly straight at their sides, feet together, and head tilted at a slight angle. I sat still, waiting for this person to step into the room or announce their presence. I turned my head to the doorway. There was nobody in the hall. The hallway was brightly lit too, and visible for maybe about 20 meters in either direction. I could see the reflection of the hallway lights on the floor and the wall of the elevator lobby at the far end too. But there were no obstructions. No pillars, no alcoves where a person could hide. I looked back at the floor, and the shadow remained exactly where it was. I stood up from my chair, and as my body blocked the direct line of sight between the hallway lights and the cubicle wall, I expected the shadow to shift or maybe disappear based on the change in the lighting. But it didn't behave that way. As I rose, the shadow didn't stretch or distort as it would if it were being cast by a physical object intercepting a light source. Instead, it sort of retracted. The edges pulled inward toward the center point of the shadow until the entire shape just vanished. I walked immediately to the doorway after seeing that. It was weird. I checked the hallway, the fire exit, and even the supply closet adjacent to the office. The fire exit was locked from the inside with a magnetic seal. I opened the door to the elevator lobby and it was empty. I walked the length of the 3rd floor, checking behind every stack of shipping pallets and into every partitioned office space. There was nobody else on the floor. I returned to my desk and sat down. I remained there for the next 30 minutes, observing the floor and the doorway. Nothing returned. I continued my shift until 6 in the morning. During the remaining hours, I heard no footsteps, no doors opening or closing, and no mechanical noises that would suggest other people were in the building. I even verified the security logs the following morning. The facility's electronic card swipe system recorded no entries or exits on the 3rd floor during the entire duration of the graveyard shift that I was on. I never saw the shadow again during the 6 months that I worked at that facility. I examined the lighting fixtures all the time and the office furniture too, the configuration multiple times during subsequent shifts, trying to identify something, a light arrangement or maybe an object that could have projected that specific silhouette, but there was just nothing in that office that could account for it. No furniture, no equipment, and no lighting configuration either that could have created a shadow matching the shape and the behavior of the one that I observed. I was 12 years old, attending a summer camp in the rural interior of British Columbia. It was the mid-90s, and the camp consisted of a series of wooden cabins spread across a ridge overlooking a lake. I shared a cabin with 3 other boys. The counselors were in a separate structure about 50 yards down the trail. One afternoon, our cabin group was split. 2 of the boys had gone to the lake for swimming lessons, and my other cabin mate was helping with kitchen duty. I stayed behind to finish a book. It was about 3 p.m. and the camp was quiet. In fact, most of the campers were down by the water. I heard the heavy screen door of the cabin creak open and slam shut. I didn't look up from my book immediately, assuming that it was one of the other boys coming back early. I heard footsteps on the wooden floorboards, fast, deliberate strides, followed by the sound of someone rummaging through a backpack in the corner. "Did you guys finish early?" I asked, still reading. There was no answer. The rustling in the corner intensified. It sounded like somebody grabbing loose papers and gear. "Seriously, man, did the swim get cancelled or something?" Still nothing. The footsteps crossed the floor again, moving toward the front door. I finally closed my book and looked up. The corner where the backpack was kept was empty. The door was shut. The cabin was completely silent. I stood up and walked over to the backpack. It was untouched. The zipper seemed to be closed exactly as I had left it. I checked under the beds and inside the small closet. There was nobody in the cabin. I walked out onto the porch and scanned the path leading down to the lake. The trail was visible for about 100 yards before it dipped into the tree line, and it was empty too. There was nobody in sight, and no one could have made it down to the tree line in the 3 seconds that it took me to cross the room. I walked down to the kitchen area to find my cabin mate. He was there, helping move crates of supplies. I asked him if he had come back to the cabin at any point. He told me that he hadn't left the kitchen since lunch. I walked down to the lake and I found the other boys still in the water, just starting their drills, and I went back to the cabin, sat on the porch until they returned. I didn't mention it to the counselors, mostly because I didn't want to explain why I thought that somebody had broken into our gear. But the rest of the week, well, it was pretty normal. No other incidents occurred in that cabin or anywhere else on the grounds, and I never found any footprints in the dirt outside the door. Nothing was missing from the backpack. But I still think about the sound of those footsteps, how specific the weight and the rhythm were, and how impossible it would have been for anyone to enter and leave the cabin without being seen on the open trail at least. And look, I don't have any mental health issues, I don't do any drugs, I don't even drink. So I know that what I heard was really what I heard. But that begs the question, what the heck was I hearing that day? So I was a seasonal forestry technician working out of a remote ranger station in the Bitterroot Mountains. The station was a small prefabricated cabin used for fire watch coordination, sitting on the ridge about 10 miles from the nearest access road. I was stationed there for a 3-week rotation to manage communications and monitor weather patterns. The cabin, it was divided into 2 distinct areas. The original structure, built in the 1960s, consisting of a reinforced workroom and a sleeping quarters, and a modern utility shed bolted to the north wall for storage and emergency gear. It was late in the year and the nights there were absolutely freezing, and the wind regularly gusted through the mountain pass. On my 10th day, I was sitting on the primary radio console in the workroom. It was about 2:45 in the morning. I was monitoring the frequencies, listening to the static, when I heard a distinct sound from the utility shed. It was the sound of heavy metal shelving being shifted against the concrete floor. It was a low, scraping metallic grind that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and sidearm, standard procedure for wildlife deterrence in the backcountry. I stepped out of the workroom and through the connecting door into the utility shed. But when I did, the shed was empty. The metal shelving units were bolted to the wall and showed no sign of having been moved. The gear stored on them, sleeping bags, lanterns, canisters, was all undisturbed. I stepped back into the workroom and sat down at the radio again. 2 minutes later, the scraping sound started again. It was louder this time too, accompanied by a thudding sound against the interior wall that separated the workroom from the storage shed. I checked the wall. It was solid timber. I walked outside to the perimeter of the shed. The ground was covered in a light layer of frost from the previous evening, and I walked the entire circumference of the structure. There were no tracks, no animals, no humans, nothing. I went back inside, uneasy this time, and sat in the center of the workroom, keeping the flashlight focused on the door of the storage shed. The activity stopped. I remained silent for the next 3 hours, listening. The following night, the same pattern repeated. I would be working at the console, and the storage area would become the source of intense physical noise again. And as soon as I approached the door, the sound ceased. I checked the interior of the shed 5 times that night too. I checked the locking mechanism on the exterior door, which was secured with a heavy-duty carabiner. Nothing was seemingly out of place too. I spent the final 2 days of my rotation sleeping in my truck, parked 50 yards away from the cabin. I heard nothing from the truck, and when I handed over the station to the next technician on the Sunday that I was supposed to leave, I mentioned that the storage shed had some strange acoustic issues, but I didn't elaborate any further. I left the area, and I haven't worked in that specific sector since then. I never did find a structural or environmental reason for that noise, and really, I don't know what to make of it. I was 17 at the time, participating in an intensive 2-week archaeological field school in southern New Mexico. We were excavating a pre-Columbian site on a high desert mesa, miles from the nearest town. The participants, they lived in a sort of permanent tent camp organized in a grid there. My specific duty involved cataloging artifacts recovered from a trench at the northern edge of the site. It was July at the time, and the heat was pretty persistent until the sun dipped below the horizon, of course, when the temperature would drop really abruptly. On the 5th day, I stayed at the trench after the rest of the crew had returned to camp for dinner. I wanted to finish labeling a cluster of pottery shards that I had uncovered. It was just after 8 p.m. and the light was fading. I was hunched over the site, my headlamp focused on the ground, when I felt a sudden change in the air temperature. A drop so sharp that my breath immediately began to fog a little bit. I reached for my trowel, which I had placed on the dirt beside me. My hand didn't make contact with the tool, and instead it sort of brushed against something that felt like heavy, coarse fabric. I instantly looked up, and directly in front of me, partially obscured by the shifting dust of the trench, was a man. He was crouched on the opposite side of the dig site, face down, his hands buried deep into the exposed earth. He was wearing a dark, textured material that looked like woven wool matted with dirt. I instantly froze. My first thought was that another student had come back to help, but the posture was just wrong, and he was like perfectly still, his spine curved in a really unnatural, rigid arc, and he didn't seem to be breathing. He was that still. Hey, I said, my voice sounding thin in the open space. The crew is back up at camp. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the sound, it seemed. I stood up slowly. Keeping my eyes fixed on him, I began to back away toward the equipment truck parked about 30 yards out. I watched him the entire time, and he was like a statue. He was that still, and he didn't move. He remained in that exact position, hands dug in the dirt, head pressed against the soil, and didn't even move an inch. I reached the truck, and I scrambled into the driver's seat. I kept the engine off and just watched the trench through the windshield. I waited for him to stand up, to turn around, or to walk away, or to do something. But 10 minutes passed. The light failed completely, and I switched on my high beams, flooding the trench with the white light, and as soon as I did, the trench was empty. There was no one there. I drove back to the main camp, and I spoke to the lead instructor about this. We returned to the site with a group of 4 people carrying heavy-duty flashlights. We searched the entire mesa for at least an hour, but we couldn't find anything. The pottery shards that I'd been labeling were right there where I had left them too. The area where the man had been crouching was undisturbed, the surface of the soil showing no signs of displacement or recent activity. After that, though, I spent the rest of the trip in a sleeping bag in a communal supply tent with other people. Thankfully, nothing else happened, but I never did go back to that northern trench again after that. I will never forget that night, and just how unbelievably still that man was. So I was 19 at the time, working as a temporary clerk at an archive building in downtown Tallahassee, Florida. The building, it was a concrete structure constructed in the late 1970s, I think, characterized by massive unadorned walls, long sterile corridors, and high-security storage vaults buried deep in the basement. During the day, it was a hive of people, but at night, the atmosphere shifted towards something profoundly isolating. For anyone who's lived in Florida, you know that the heat is pretty oppressive even at night, and the facility's aging HVAC system struggled to maintain a consistent temperature, resulting in pockets of stagnant, humid air throughout the upper floors. My shift officially ended at 9 p.m., at which point the professional staff would depart, leaving me to finish the remaining filing tasks in the second-floor reference room. I was typically the last person in the building, responsible for verifying the security status of the reference area before heading down to the lobby. On a Tuesday, I was wrapping up a project. It was about 9:15. The silence in the building was punctuated only by the cycling of the cooling units in the ceiling. I packed my bag, turned off the main overhead lights, and walked out into the central corridor. The facility utilized an automated lighting system that shifted into a low-wattage security mode after hours. This created a sequence of pools of dim yellow light interspread throughout the long flickering shadows that stretched toward the elevator bank at the far end of the hall. I began to walk toward the elevator. The floor was actually polished concrete, and my footsteps sounded sharp and loud in the cavernous space. About 30 feet ahead of me, a figure emerged from a side office and stepped into the center of the walkway. It was a man, dressed in a standard-issue dark gray maintenance uniform, the same type worn by the facility teams during the day. He had his back to me, facing the elevators, and he stood perfectly still, his posture stiff with his arms hanging loose at his sides. "Building's closing," I said, my voice echoing slightly against the concrete floors. I assumed that he was one of the night shift security team members that I hadn't met yet, perhaps somebody doing a final sweep of the upper levels. He didn't acknowledge me. He remained motionless, staring at the elevator doors. I walked closer, my footsteps continuing to echo on the floor. I reached a point maybe about 10 feet away from him, and that was when something weird happened. I stopped walking, and I could see the texture of the gray fabric of his uniform, the slight fraying at the collar and the way that his hair was trimmed, but I couldn't hear his breathing. I couldn't hear the rustle of the fabric as he sort of shifted. He was just sort of standing there, lurched over. The shifting of the weight, the rise and the fall of his chest was not there, though. He was just sort of standing there, weirdly, and it really creeped me out. "Hey, are you locked in?" I asked, my voice louder now, tinged with a sudden sharp prickle of apprehension for sure. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. Instead, he tilted his head slightly to the left, a slow movement that seemed to creak almost, as if his neck was stiff and was cracking. And then, I swear to you that he just simply dissolved. Now, it wasn't a fade out. What I mean is that the image of the man seemed to sort of like shudder a little bit, like a digital broadcast losing signal, or maybe like a holographic projection being disrupted by interference. The sharp edges of his uniform frayed into fine flickering lines of static before he collapsed inward into a sort of single vertical light, and then that line hovered for a fraction of a second, shuddered, and vanished entirely. I stood in the middle of that hallway for several minutes, my breath caught in my throat and my heart going 1,000 miles an hour, staring at the empty floor where this guy had just been standing. There were no doorways nearby where he could have ducked out or anything. The hallway was a straight, featureless line, and there were no sort of places to hide, no closets, no side passages within 15 feet of the elevator bank. I eventually walked to the exact spot where he had been standing, too. When I got there, too, there was this god-awful smell. The only thing that I know that compares to it that I've smelled before is like rotten eggs. I checked the elevator call button. It had not been pressed. The lights on the floor indicator were dark, and I abandoned the plan to take the elevator, and I ended up sprinting down the stairwell to the lobby after that. I walked directly to the security desk. The guard on duty looked up and was startled by my appearance, I think. I pointed to the security monitor for the second floor hallway, which was active, showing a clear empty corridor. I asked him to pull up the tape for the last 10 minutes. We sat there and watched the feed. The monitor, it showed me walking down the hall, my bag over my shoulder, but it didn't show the man at any point. When I reached the spot where he had stood, the video showed me stopping, looking around, and then just running toward the stairs. There was nobody else in the frame, and the moments where I had stood there watching this guy, well, they just weren't there. I didn't return to that place the next day. In fact, I took the day off, and I just didn't know what to think about it all. I eventually went back to work after a long weekend, and I tried not to stay late after that. But thankfully, I never did experience anything there again. I never found out if anybody else at the facility had experienced something similar while I was there for a couple of years after this. And after I moved on, I lost contact. The MV Serenity was docked in the port of Busan for an emergency engine overhaul that had been scheduled with less than 24 hours' notice. I was 22, working my first rotation as a junior maintenance engineer, and because I was the lowest-ranking member of the engine room crew, I was assigned the graveyard shift. The ship was effectively a floating tomb of steel. The rest of the crew had taken shore leave as soon as the vessel cleared customs, leaving the ship anchored in the dock with only a skeleton watch of 2 security guards stationed at the main gangway of the deck above. It was early hours of the morning on a Wednesday. The lower hull had these sort of cramped and interconnected steel corridors leading toward the main propeller shaft assembly room. The temperature was consistently above 30 degrees Celsius as well, and the air was dense with the smell of diesel and hydraulic oil and stagnated salt water. The ambient sound of the water against the hull, and the sound generated by the cooling fan still running in the secondary power distribution units, was ongoing. I was positioned near the rear bulkhead, working on the primary hydraulic dampeners. I had the casing removed, exposing the internal seals, and I reached into my toolbox to grab a 14mm wrench, my hands slick with sweat, and as I withdrew the tool, my flashlight beam swept across the access hatch, located roughly 20 feet down the walkway. And when it hit there, a person was standing there. He was wearing standard-issue charcoal grey coveralls, identical to the ones that I was wearing. He stood on the raised metal grating of the walkway, his hands resting on the guardrail. He was looking intently at the propeller shaft assembly, and he lacked the required hard hat, safety goggles, or reflective vest mandated for anyone inside of the engine compartment. "I need to see your ID," I said. My voice sounded flat and thin against the oppressive roar of the ventilation system, though. I stood up, keeping the wrench in my hand. I assumed that a contractor had snuck on board, or a crew member had returned early and was wandering. Though how they had bypassed the security check at the gangway, that was beyond me. He didn't acknowledge me, though. He didn't turn his head or change his stance. He just sort of remained there, staring at the mechanical housing of the shaft. "This is a restricted area," I repeated, walking toward him. "You need to show me your permit or get back to the main deck, now." I stopped walking when I reached a distance maybe about 10 feet away from him. I watched him closely. His posture was really rigid, and as I scanned him with my light, I noticed that the fabric of his coveralls appeared faded, almost colorless in the harsh LED beam. He turned his head at that point. The movement, though, was not fluid. His entire torso shifted as a singular unit, in fact, pivoting at the hips instead of the neck, as if the vertebrae were fused into a single steel rod. He looked directly at me, and I really struggled to describe this, but his face was a complete blur of, featureless skin. What I mean is that he didn't have eyes, a nose, or a mouth, just a flat, pallid surface that absorbed the light of my torch almost. Obviously, he didn't speak because he didn't have a mouth, but he turned toward me for about 3 seconds, then turned back toward the propeller shaft. He took a single deliberate step backward into the dark void of the access hatch. I then rushed to the hatch, hitting the metal frame with my shoulder, and I leaned through and shimmied my light into the secondary corridor that led to the auxiliary tank room. But he was gone. I sprinted down the hall, expecting to see him scrambling toward the exit ladder. The auxiliary room was silent. I checked the main engine control room, the fuel intake valve area, and the emergency escape route leading up to the second deck, but every door was sealed. The heavy watertight locks were engaged, showing no signs of having been opened recently. I climbed the ladder to the main deck and found the security guards sitting in their booth near the gangway. They were playing cards, their radio playing quiet music. They confirmed to me that no one had boarded or left the ship since midnight. No crew had returned, and no contractors had been cleared for work. I didn't say anything about this guy's face because, quite honestly, I didn't want to seem crazy to them, but I returned to the lower hull with both guards, and we spent 40 minutes searching every square meter of that engine room. We checked the bilges, the shaft tunnels, the storage lockers, and we never found anyone. When I pointed out the exact spot where the figure had stood, the guards inspected the grating, and there were no boot prints in the heavy layer of oil and grease that coated the floor there. My own boots had left clear muddy impressions, though, but the area where the man had been was pristine, undisturbed and empty. Like I said, we searched that place top to bottom, but we never did find anyone. I stayed in the control room, under the fluorescent lights, until the next day. I refused to go back into the lower hull alone for the remainder of the ship's time in port as well. I eventually requested a transfer to a different vessel once we reached the next destination. I never found a crew member who matched the description of the man in the coveralls. Honestly, I thought that maybe the guy's face was a mask or something as well, and I never found anyone else who had been in the engine room that night. So, whoever that was, I still have no idea how they got in there. The trail was the old Loggers Path in Pennsylvania, a 27-mile loop through dense, second-growth forest. It was November, late in the season, and the canopy had long since shed its leaves, leaving the woods brittle and sort of skeletal. I was hiking the loop alone, carrying a 3-day pack. I planned to reach the central ridge by the second evening. I camped near a creek junction at 6 p.m. The air temperature dropped rapidly to near freezing. I was the only person in the valley that I could see. The nearest civilization was a 40-mile drive through twisting mountain roads. I left camp at 7:30 in the morning. I hiked steadily toward the ridgeline. The forest? It was uncharacteristically silent as well. No birds, no wind, no rustle of squirrels in the dry underbrush. I reached the section of the trail that narrowed significantly, though, squeezed between two jagged, moss-covered rock faces, and I stopped. I stopped because I heard a sound. It was a striking sound, like a heavy hammer hitting a dead, hollow tree trunk. The impact occurred once every 4 seconds, I would say, with precise regularity. I scanned the trees. Nothing was visible through the dense screen of saplings. I continued walking, my boots crunching loudly on the frozen leaves. And then the sound moved to parallel me, deeper in the brush, maintaining a steady distance of roughly 30 meters maybe. I stopped again, though. The sound ceased instantly, and it was as if it was cut by a switch. I moved forward. The sound resumed, matching my pace with unnerving accuracy. I reached a small clearing at about 9 in the morning. I sat on a large, lichen-covered log to eat a snack and check my bearings. As I reached into my pack, I heard the sound again, but this time it was directly behind a log, less than 5 feet away. It was a heavy, dull thud, the sound of something massive striking the earth, followed by the sharp, splintering crack of wood. It sounded as though a tree limb of the size of a human torso had been snapped in two. I stood up slowly and faced the tree line, my hand hovering near the bear spray on my belt. I saw no movement, but the smell hit me suddenly. An odor of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something sharper, ammonia maybe. It was powerful enough to make my eyes water, though, and I didn't wait to investigate. I hiked toward the next trail marker, located 1 mile ahead, pushing my pace to the point of exhaustion. The atmosphere in the woods, it felt compressed, as if the air itself was becoming viscous and difficult to breathe. I felt a persistent prickling sensation too on the back of my neck, that distinct feeling of being watched by something. When I finally reached the trail marker, I pulled out my GPS unit to verify my distance. I stared at the screen. The device displayed the time as 12:45 p.m. I checked my watch. I'd been hiking for 90 minutes according to my internal pace. The GPS indicated 3 hours and 45 minutes had passed, though, and that's when I realized that 2 hours of my day were simply missing, unaccounted for. They were just gone. I didn't stop again after that. I hiked the remaining stretch to the trailhead with my head down, ignoring the occasional snap of branches and the feeling of heavy footsteps trailing just behind my periphery. Eventually, I reached my vehicle, and man was I glad to see it, and drove to the nearest town without stopping. I checked into a motel, absolutely exhausted, locked the door, and spent the night with the lights on, listening for any sound outside. And thankfully, I didn't hear anything. So I've been listening to stories here for a while, but hearing some of the posts about weirdly intense boundary crosses reminded me of an old job that I had back in 2018. I still think about it because it made me realize just how fast things can really spin out when you're young, isolated, and trying way too hard to keep the peace. At the time that this happened, I had just moved into a coastal port town in Chile. I didn't have a lot of money or any local connections, so I took a position as an administrator at a private container logistics warehouse near the docks. The setup was basically a small detached security booth and a back office trailer stuck right against the northern perimeter wall. And every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I'd sit alone in that back trailer with a stack of physical manifests, and I would cross-reference the shipment ledger against an old internal desktop terminal. If the seal numbers or origin stamps didn't line up perfectly, I had to log the error and flag the container for customs holding. The only other person on the property at the time was the manager. His name was Georges. Georges had worked the port for decades and was one of those hyper-intense, socially awkward guys who completely lacked an off switch. Because it was just the two of us in a massive, desolate gravel yard for 8 hours a night, he assumed that we were best friends. At first, it was harmless, but it was also really annoying. He would spend his smoke breaks standing right inside of the trailer door, asking me if I was enjoying the work and asking if I was lonely so far from home, over-explaining the mechanics of each of the reach stackers, and I'd just smile, nod, and try to look busy so I could get back to the ledger. By the end of the third week, though, the harmless vibe really started shifting. He began messaging my personal phone outside of work hours. I had given my number to the office manager for emergency shift coverage, but Jorge apparently took it from the master roster. First, it was just unsolicited photos of his stray dogs or links to local news articles, but then it became invitations. He'd ask if I wanted to go for morning drives along the cliffs after our shift, or see the hidden fish markets that tourists didn't know about. He even offered to drive me to the city on my days off so that I wouldn't have to take the bus anymore. I kept making polite excuses though, saying that I was too tired or had to call my family back home, and I never explicitly told him to back off because, he was technically my supervisor, and I didn't want to cause any drama at a job that I desperately needed at the time. That was my first mistake. My politeness just gave him room to escalate. One Thursday night, though, I showed up to the trailer and found a massive heavy woolen poncho sitting right at my desk chair, and it looked brand new. Jorge walked into the trailer 2 minutes later, grinning. He said that the marine fog was supposed to roll in thick after midnight, and he noticed that I was always cold in my standard jacket. It wasn't a casual gesture, though. It felt way too heavy and domestic for a guy that I barely knew. I laughed nervously and said that I couldn't accept it, but he immediately got defensive. "What? I'm just looking out for you," he said. "People in this town aren't usually this soft." The rest of the night was incredibly tense, too. During our 2 a.m. break, he sat across from me in the tiny break corner and started talking about his long-term plans. He went on this massive, serious tangent about how the port was decaying, how he wanted to buy a small farm further south in a different region, and how people our age shouldn't waste their lives living alone in a sketchy harbor rental. He kept looking at me expectantly too, like we were planning a future together instead of just waiting for the 3:15 a.m. freighter update. I was literally texting my roommate as well, under the desk, typing, "The yard manager is completely cornering me right now. This is so uncomfortable." Then, midway through the shift, Jorge suddenly mentioned that he had handled the logs for the upcoming weekend. I told him that I didn't understand what he meant. He smirked and said that he had gone into the scheduling system and manually approved a 3-day personal leave window for both of us starting Friday morning. He told me that he had already booked a small cabin up near the reservoir hills because the ocean air ruins your lungs after a while. He literally had his truck packed out in the lot, extra blankets, rations, everything. He hadn't asked me once, though. He assumed that because I hadn't explicitly yelled at him over the messages, that I was totally on board with a weekend isolation trip in the mountains now. I just stared at him. The confusion turned into immediate panic. I told him absolutely not. I said that I wasn't going anywhere, that he needed to fix the schedule immediately, and that I wasn't interested in any trips outside of work. His face immediately dropped. He got incredibly flushed, tried to laugh it off as a joke, but his tone then suddenly turned aggressive. He started saying that I was overreacting, that he'd spent half of his weekly pay on the cabin deposit, and that he thought that I understood the layout of how things worked here. That line made my stomach turn a bit. Understood the layout of this place? I told him that I was going to the main gate to check the incoming manifest gate logs, mostly just needing an excuse to get out of the cramped trailer and away from him. I grabbed my clipboard. I left my small canvas bag on the desk and I walked away. When I came back 10 minutes later, my bag was exactly where I'd left it. But my personal phone, that was missing from my side pocket. I checked my coat, looked under the ledger paperwork, and then turned to Jorge, who was leaning against the printer, and I asked him if he had seen it. He reached into his heavy work vest, pulled the phone out just far enough for me to see it, and slid it back in. "Relax," he said. using this awful patronizing tone. "I'm just keeping it safe so that we can actually finish our conversation without you calling your roommate to bail you out." The desire to remain polite completely evaporated at this moment. I didn't try to negotiate. I stepped toward the trailer door, but he was blocking the narrow walkway. I raised my voice, screaming at him to give it right back now. He kept trying to play it off as a joke, telling me that I was being dramatic and saying, "I'm not a criminal, look at me, I'm just trying to talk to you." I didn't care. I grabbed a heavy metal hole puncher off the desk, held it up, and shouted that if he didn't move away from the door and give me my phone, I was going to break the trailer window and trip the main yard alarm. The shift in his personality was instantaneous. He went from smug and defensive to incredibly nervous, laughing frantically and waving his hands. He tossed the phone onto the desk, muttered something about me being unstable, and stepped back out into the gravel lot. I grabbed my phone, bolted out of the trailer, and ran all the way to the outer perimeter gate. The port security guard at the main barrier saw me running, and when I told him the yard manager had taken my property, he let me sit in the guard shack until the morning bus arrived at 6:15. But the absolute worst part of the story, that didn't happen until I got back to my room. So I was sitting on my mattress, still completely wired and trembling from the adrenaline, just trying to process the fact that I'd almost been lured into a truck and driven into the mountains. I unlocked my phone to delete his contact number, and when the screen opened, my messaging app was already active. Right at the top of the history was an outgoing text to an unsaved international number with a Mexican country code. It had been sent during the exact 10 minutes that I was out checking the gate logs. The first message from George's text read, "Got the contact info." The second message, sent 30 seconds later, read, "She's fighting it right now." There was no response from the other number. I sat there in my quiet room for an hour, staring at those two sentences. The sheer coldness of realizing that while he was smiling at me and pretending to be a lonely, awkward coworker, that he was actively using my unlocked phone to coordinate with somebody else completely broke me. I didn't know if he was trying to sell my information, venting to a friend, or something infinitely worse, but whatever the case, it was definitely not okay. I never did go back to the warehouse. I called the officer manager from a public phone the next morning, told them that I was quitting effectively immediately due to a safety issue, and blocked George's number permanently. He tried calling from various burner numbers for nearly 6 months after that too. He'd send these massive, sprawling paragraphs apologizing, saying that he was just lonely, or sending photos of the yard to show me just how quiet it was without me. I never replied a single time. The last notification came through during the lockdowns in 2020. Just a short text saying, "Hope you survived the port." I deleted it without opening the preview. I moved into an old cottage-style rental on the edge of a university town in upstate New York about 6 months ago. It's an isolated patch of land, bordered by an old apple orchard that hasn't been maintained since like the 90s. I'm 21, doing online classes, and living with 2 guys that I met through a housing group. The property has a long gravel driveway, and my bedroom window faces the first row of dead apple trees. At night, the orchard is completely black because the nearest streetlight is like half a mile down the main road. And the situation, well, that started back in like September sometime. I was sitting at my desk around midnight, finishing an essay, and my cat, who usually sleeps on my bed, suddenly jumped onto the windowsill. Her ears were pinned completely flat, and she was staring intently into the dark branches outside. I turned off my desk lamp so that I could see past the glass reflection, and from somewhere deep in the first row of trees, I saw something move. Then I heard something as well. It sounded like somebody snapping their fingers. Then there was a long pause and then another snap, but this time slightly closer. I stared for about 2 minutes but couldn't see anything through the thick branches. I figured that it must be a stray animal or maybe a branch settling in the cold or something, so I pulled the blinds down and I went to bed. But it didn't stop. For weeks, every time my roommates went away for the weekend, this clicking would start at around 1 in the morning. It was never random and it was always a distinct, deliberate pattern. 3 quick snaps, a 10-second silence, and then 2 more. My cat began refusing to sit near that window entirely. She'd hide under the bed the second that the sun went down, in fact. By December, the ground had frozen solid, and one morning my roommate asked if I'd been messing around outside his window because he found deep, heavy indentations in the frost right under his sill. The strange thing, though, is that they weren't standard shoe prints. They looked like somebody had been standing there in a heavy, flat-soled wading boot, either extremely heavy or shifting their weight back and forth for hours and sort of digging in. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a utility worker or a hunter cutting through the orchard, but the details, they just didn't line up. The absolute breaking point, though, happened only last Tuesday. My roommates were both up at a ski lodge for the winter break, and that left me alone in the house. It was a completely silent night, no wind at all, and around 2 in the morning I woke up to my cat frantically clawing at my bedroom door to get out. And then the clicking started. Except this time, it wasn't coming from the orchard. It was coming from the side porch, right outside of our kitchen door. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and walked down the hallway, keeping the lights off so that I wouldn't silhouette myself. The kitchen door has a small frosted glass panel at the top, and as I got closer, I saw a pale bluish light moving erratically through the frosted glass. It looked like somebody was holding a cheap LED pen light right against the pane, angling it downward to see through the gap in the interior curtain. I didn't think. I just slammed my hand against the wood and shouted as loud as I could that I was calling the police. The light? It didn't turn off, though. Instead, the silhouette on the other side of the glass shifted. A tall, completely motionless figure in a heavy winter coat just stood there, pressed against the door. He didn't try to run or hide. He just slowly raised one arm and then leant against the glass panel, and that was it. I instantly bolted back to my room, though, locked the door and dialed 911. The state troopers, they took about 20 minutes to arrive, and by the time that they cleared the porch, the person was gone. They did find heavy tracks leading back into the dead trees, but the snow was too powdery to get a clear mold, and the trooper told me that there had been similar reports of a prowler targeting isolated student rentals along the county line, usually checking door handles and also looking for spare keys left under mats. But they didn't see what I found on the porch deck the next morning. Right under the kitchen doorknob, sitting on the welcome mat, was a small, neat pile of dried cat food, the exact brand that I buy. My cat wouldn't even go near that door. She sniffed the air from 5 feet away and started hissing. I've moved my desk to the living room now, and the landlord finally put a motion sensor floodlight over the side porch. I haven't seen the blue light since the troopers came out, thankfully, but last night, the floodlight suddenly kicked on at 3:15 in the morning. When I looked through the blinds, the porch was completely empty, but from somewhere deep in the blackness of the orchard rows, I heard that same dry, muffled finger snap again. So I'm sharing this here because the local precinct handles these calls like minor neighborhood nuisances, but the persistence of this is completely messing with my head. So in the spring of 2023, I was actually 23 and renting a small basement-level apartment in the outer avenues of Richmond, Virginia. The property was an old brick house converted into units, backed by a narrow gravel alleyway and a dense row of overgrown private hedges that separated our lot from a commercial storage yard. My kitchen window sat right at ground level, looking directly into the base of those hedges. I worked late shifts at a commercial bakery, so I would get home at around 1:30 every morning, and usually would spend an hour decompressing in the kitchen, making food, unwinding and all that. Now, as I was walking down the alley from the car to the basement entrance, listening to the usual night sounds like the interstate and the wind through the power lines, suddenly everything just sounded completely muffled. Then I heard a short, wet whistling sound from the darkness of the hedges. It wasn't a bird call or a person whistling a tune. It was a single, sharp sort of intake of breath through teeth, maybe, almost like a controlled hiss. The moment that I stopped to look into the brush as well, it cut off instantly. I thought that was really weird, but I thought at the time that it was probably just an animal. Anyway, a few days later, I noticed a physical change near the low timber retaining wall by the alley entrance. The gravel and the dead leaves had been completely cleared away from a specific 2-foot section, exposing the bare mud beneath it. It wasn't a random disturbance, though. The dirt had been packed down hard and flat. I don't know what that was about, but it was certainly odd and definitely not random. Again, though, I just tried to ignore it, assuming that it was just someone using the alley as a shortcut, but then the timing became, well, coordinated. So, I'd step out of my car at like 1:45 in the morning, and the moment that my boots hit the gravel, that sharp controlled hiss would come from the darkness to my left. If I walked fast, I'd hear the heavy rustling of the leaves moving parallel to me, matching my speed down the length of the fence line. When I paused at my door to grab my keys, the rustling would stop dead. I never turned my flashlight on it, because I was terrified of confirming what was actually sitting in those shadows. But then, my landlord was doing some renovations on the upper floors, so the building was completely empty except for me. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was standing by the stove waiting for the water to boil. The lower blinds on my kitchen window were cracked open a few inches, and out of nowhere, a faint white reflection flickered against the kitchen cabinets. It wasn't a broad flashlight beam or a phone screen or anything. It was sort of a bluish white light maybe, held completely still near the base of the retaining wall outside. It stayed fixed, pointing straight down at the packed mud, then slowly tilted upward toward the glass. As I stepped toward the window to pull the cord shut, the light illuminated the lower half of a person crouching. They were wearing a stiff, heavy canvas work coat, covered in like yellow clay dust or something. They weren't moving or anything, but then this sound right against the glass. It was that weird hissing sound again, but it sounded so close this time. Upon hearing it, I bolted into the bathroom, locked the door, and I called the police. The Richmond police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched the alley and the perimeter of the storage yard, but they found the area clear. The officer who took my statement basically just said to call them again if I see anything or whatever, but they couldn't really do much more than what they had done. The next morning, when the sun was up, I went outside to check around a bit, and right where that person had been crouching, there were rusty iron railroad spikes lined up perfectly side by side. Well, upon seeing that, I packed my essentials into my car that afternoon and I stayed at a friend's place until my lease ended. I didn't go back to the apartment alone after dark because I genuinely felt like somebody was out there and that they were messing with me. Also, these days, I don't take ground floor rentals any longer. So, I wanted to post this somewhere because I'm currently driving across the state line to a new place and looking at the motel keys on my passenger seat is the only thing keeping me from convincing myself that I completely made the whole thing up. So, in the summer of 2023, I was moving from Denver down to New Mexico for a fresh start. I didn't have much money, so I threw everything that I owned into the back of my Honda Civic and planned the drive over 2 days. On the first night, a massive thunderstorm rolled over the interstate near Raton, reducing visibility to almost zero. I pulled off at the first exit with a sign and checked into an old, unrated 2-story concrete motel stuck right between a defunct truck stop and an open expanse of desert scrubland. The front office clerk gave me the key to room 114 on the ground floor. The layout was pretty standard. A single queen bed, a laminate desk, and a rear bathroom window that looked out onto a narrow gravel service lane, and a high chain-link perimeter fence. Now, the first indication that something was off was incredibly minute. I woke up at around 10 the next morning, feeling completely wiped out from the drive. While packing my duffel bag, I noticed small illogical discrepancies in the room. Like a plastic bottle of water, I always kept perfectly upright on the nightstand, was lying flat on its side. A generic paper notepad by the telephone, well, that had been shifted from the center of the desk to the far edge. Later, when I went to brush my teeth, the small bar of complimentary soap under the mirror was unwrapped and sitting in the dry basin, even though I definitely had not opened it yet. I wrote it all off, though, as my own sleep-deprived clumsiness from the night before. I mean, when you crawl into a strange bed at 2 in the morning during a torrential downpour, your memory plays tricks on you for sure. In other words, it just wasn't enough to make me paranoid or anything, but I certainly noticed it. Anyway, right around 7:15, I had walked out to my car in the gravel lot to retrieve an extra quart of oil from the trunk before the midday heat hit. The morning air was dead silent, the desert fog was hanging low over the asphalt, and on my way back down the exterior concrete breezeway, I almost stepped directly into a woman coming out of the narrow ice machine alcove right next to my door. It was the guest staying in room 112, a woman in her late 20s who I'd noticed the day before sitting on the motel steps. We hadn't spoken yet. What made me hesitate, though, was her physical state. You see, her denim jacket looked distinctly damp around the shoulders, not from the morning mist, but in a heavy sort of localized way, almost like she'd been leaning hard against a wet wall or something. There was also a strong, clean scent of hotel-grade mint shampoo and fresh ironed sheets trailing off of her that felt completely out of place against the smell of old grease and dry dirt that dominated the breezeway. In any case, we exchanged a brief, awkward nod, and she moved quickly down the walkway toward the front office without a word. When I reached my door, the brass deadbolt, though, was completely unslotted, and the door was resting against the frame, held shut only by the loose interior latch chain. That was the detail that really didn't sit right with me. I am incredibly systematic about checking that deadbolt until it clicks, specifically because the car was full of my valuables and the motel area felt completely isolated, so I wanted to make sure everything was locked up in there. Inside, the room appeared untouched, but the physical arrangement had definitely been altered. My personal canvas backpack, for instance, which I always kept zipped up and tucked neatly somewhere, this time between the desk leg and the wall, was sitting in the middle of the unmade mattress. The main zipper was pulled closed, but my vehicle registration folder inside had been turned over. The small plastic clip that I used to keep the insurance cards organized had been removed from the front sleeve and placed neatly on the very back of the logbook instead. It had definitely been inspected and looked at for sure and then left behind for some reason. Later that afternoon, I saw the woman again by the vending machines near the office. I walked over, keeping my voice entirely neutral and casual, and asked if she had noticed any maintenance workers checking the ground floor units that morning, or if the front desk had needed to verify the water pressure in our block or anything. She didn't look up from the selection screen. She dropped her quarters into the slot and said, sometimes the office needs to verify the older infrastructure before the heat spikes the lines. It's fine. And she grabbed her drink, walked back to room 112, and threw the bolt. The explanation didn't really account for anything, I suppose. It just sort of confirmed that the perimeter of my room had been crossed without any official notification from the front desk. For the remainder of my stay, too, the micro-adjustments in the room, they continued. It was never a standard robbery or anything. My laptop remained on the desk, my emergency cash envelope inside my boot stayed full, and the expensive tools in my trunk weren't touched. It felt really like a quiet, systematic inventory of my personal space, rather than a security breach, I guess you could say. That evening, though, I went to a local department store, bought a portable heavy-duty door jammer and wedged it directly under the handle, and set up a basic motion detection app on my old phone, hiding it inside an old empty tissue box on the nightstand facing the entry door. Since that wedge was positioned, the phone logs showed the room remained entirely undisturbed. The tiny, unexplainable shifts inside of the room, they stopped completely the night that the mechanical barrier went live. Every item, it stayed perfectly fixed now. Now, it's the lack of a clean resolution that is the part that really remains frustrating for me. I mean, there was no formal police report or anything and no final answer. Just a short window of time where the contents of my room didn't match any of my movements, ending the exact second that access became mechanically impossible. Which likely means that somehow somebody was getting in there and messing with my stuff, but I was never able to catch them. And that's why I'm here, you see, because, well, I'm about to stay in another motel over the next few weeks and, well, have you guys got any ideas as to how I can keep myself safe? I really don't want anything like this to happen again, having someone coming into my room and snooping around in my stuff, so yeah, if you guys have got any ideas as to what I could do, well, I'm all ears. At the time that this happened, I was living in a shared student house in Boston. I didn't have a car, so my entire life relied on the subway system. Every Monday and Thursday night, I had a late-night biology lab that didn't wrap up until like 9:30, which meant that I was hitting the underground transit stations right as the commuter crowds thinned out and the platforms turned completely desolate. Now, I met this guy, a low-key sort of guy, during a massive pre-semester orientation mixer for the science department. But we barely spoke and just sort of ended up in the same icebreaker circle for like 10 minutes. A month later, he sort of cornered me at the campus transit hub. He asked if he could sit next to me on the inbound train because the cart was mostly empty, and I said sure, trying to be polite. For the next 20 minutes, he completely unloaded on me about his recent long-term breakup. It was heavy, intense venting, and he talked about how he couldn't sleep, how his ex had ruined his head, and how he was struggling to find a reason to clear his class schedule. It was incredibly uncomfortable, but I figured that he was just desperate for an outlet, so I listened. When the train pulled into my stop, he asked me for my info. I tried to hand over my Instagram handle, but he blocked my hand and insisted on taking my actual phone number. He said that he hated typing out feelings and preferred direct calls. I felt the pressure, got awkward, and in the end I gave it to him. I know, a huge mistake, but within 48 hours, the communication really spiked. He wasn't texting, he was calling, 3 times a day, 4 times a day even, usually at around 11 p.m. or right before dawn. I stopped picking up in the end, but the notifications kept stacking. As you can probably see too, the level of obsession, it really didn't match the fact that we had only shared one conversation on a train. I tried the passive route though, texting him that my lab schedule was drowning me, that I had zero free time, trying to build a polite wall. But it did absolutely nothing. Anyway, one day he left a voicemail for me and his voice sounded completely different, flat and urgent. He said that he had talked to one of my lab partners and needed to meet me at the central transfer station before the Thanksgiving break started. The fake urgency and the fact that he was tracking down people that I knew completely freaked me out, so I blocked his number immediately. And for a few days it was really quiet. It was nice, in fact. But then the physical tracking started. The first time that I saw him, it was in the back row of a departmental lecture series on environmental law, a subject completely outside of his major. I left through the side fire exit before the professor finished speaking just to avoid a collision. A week later, their behavior shifted to my specific transit station. The stop near my student housing has a long subterranean sort of concrete mezzanine with central support pillars and an iron stairwell leading down to the tracks. It's poorly lit, smells horrible and all that, but from the top of the stairwell, you can see the entire platform. On my way home from the lab, I noticed a figure standing perfectly still near the base of the structural pillar, directly facing my usual boarding zone. At first, I told myself that it's just a regular passenger waiting for the inbound train. But the train came, emptied out, pulled away, and the figure stayed. They weren't looking at a phone. They weren't pacing. They were just standing completely still, their face obscured by a dark hood, staring directly up at the iron stairs toward the exit gates. My exit gates. The third time that it happened, I decided to go to the top of the stairs behind the concrete turnstile barrier, just watching. The station was pretty much dead silent. The figure slowly tilted their head though, staring straight through the iron gates of the stairs toward the dark corner where I was hiding, and they stayed like that, completely motionless for a solid 2 minutes. They weren't waiting for a transit line. I knew that in that moment. And the moment that a security guard walked out from the street-level booth, the figure didn't take the exit stairs. They stepped off the back of the platform, vanishing down the narrow, dark utility walkway that leads into the activity train tunnels where pedestrians aren't even physically supposed to fit. Thankfully, too, at around that moment, my train arrived, and so I quickly scuttled on and kept a lookout, but thankfully, I wasn't followed. Around that same week, though, I got a call from an unlisted number at around 2 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. The recording was 7 seconds of total silence, followed by a male voice saying my first name once, completely deadpan, before the line just disconnected. There was something else that he'd mentioned during the first train ride that I hadn't properly processed until everything went sideways, too. He'd laughed off a story about his ex-girlfriend getting the campus administration to issue a formal Title IX no-contact directive against him, calling her delusional. At the time, I had just written it off as a messy breakup exaggeration. Looking back, though, well, that whole thing makes my skin crawl. I haven't seen him since I started taking an alternative bus route that adds about 40 minutes to my night commute, which isn't very good, but thankfully the calls have stopped, and recently I went back to the station, and thankfully the platform has stayed clear of that specific silhouette, at least as far as I can tell. But still, I just have a feeling that this whole thing isn't really over yet, and so, well, what do you guys think that I should do about it? I recently heard a story here that reminded me of a situation from years ago when I was renting a room in a converted shoe factory turned apartment complex just outside of Providence, Rhode Island. The place had been partitioned into units in the 90s, resulting in these bizarre cavernous hallways with random structure pillars and recessed doorways every few yards. I used to come back late from long drives to see friends on weekends, usually around midnight, and the building's landlord was incredibly cheap about the lighting, so the corridors were perpetually stuck in this sort of dim, flickering amber state. I started noticing, though, that whenever I rounded the main central elevator bank, I'd hear a distinct heavy rustling sound of a nylon jacket, from what I could make out, from one of the dead-end utility areas. It wasn't the sound of someone walking away either. It was the sound of someone freezing in place, the exact second that they heard my boots hit the concrete flooring. If I stopped, the entire floor went completely dead silent. If I kept moving, I could hear a faint, dragging footstep echoing from a completely different branch of the hallway than where the sound had originated from. I tried to convince myself that it was just the building's massive commercial air venting system through the old drywall shafts, but the timing was always too reactive, I guess. Anyway, one Sunday night in November, I had just gotten back from a weekend trip and was carrying 2 heavy duffel bags up the rear fire stairwell because the main elevator was out of service. When I pushed the heavy steel door to my floor open, I saw a guy standing completely still in the recessed entryway of an empty apartment halfway down my branch. He didn't have any keys out. He wasn't looking at a phone or anything. He was just standing in the dark with his hands buried in the pockets of a dark, oversized hoodie, staring straight down the corridor at the door that I had just come through. The second that he saw me drop my bags, he didn't turn around or anything. He just sort of stepped out of the recess and started walking toward the central junction. Because of the way the old support pillars cut into the hallway, he blinked out of my line of sight for maybe 2 seconds. And when I stepped forward to see where he went, the hallway branch was completely wide open and empty, but I could hear the rapid, heavy slaps of sneakers descending the front stairwell at the opposite end of the building, which meant that he had cleared 40 feet of hallway and a corner in a fraction of the amount of time that it should have taken. When I checked in with the guy who lived in the unit next to the empty recess the next day, he looked at me like I had two heads. He swore up and down that the empty apartment had been locked from the inside for months, and that nobody ever hung out in that corridor branch. But for the rest of the winter, I kept finding the heavy fire doors at the ends of the halls unlatched all the time, held open by a tiny folded piece of cardboard wedged into the frame near the top hinge, just enough to keep the latch from clicking shut, meaning that anyone could slip in from the stairwell into the residential wings without making a sound. I think that I realized pretty quickly then that just because a hallway looks empty when you glance down it doesn't always mean that you're the only person there in the dark. And so from that point on, I've had my head on a swivel the whole time, and really, I don't know what else to do about it. That exact specific panic, when you realize that you've casually handed over all your leverage to a stranger in a vehicle, is the absolute worst. The minute that the child locks click and the speed picks up, you are entirely on their timeline, and every mile feels like you're drawing a line further away from anyone who actually knows where you are. This happened a few summers back when a buddy and I took a long-distance train down to a music festival held at an old fairground site out in the rural pocket of Illinois. We got off the Amtrak at this tiny, unstaffed platform, about 15 miles from the festival gates. The station was basically just a concrete slab with a rusted metal awning. It was pushing around 5 in the afternoon, and our phones were basically useless bricks at this point, because the local towers were completely overwhelmed by the thousands of people descending on the county. We were standing by the gravel lot, trying to find a signal desperately, watching the battery bars drain, when this old faded burgundy van pulled up. The guy driving had a laminated pass hanging from his rearview mirror and leaned out the window, shouting that he was running a direct shuttle to the south camping gates for $10 a head. We threw our stuff in the back and we climbed in instantly. There were no other passengers, just a row of stained bench seats that smelled like stale air and old vinyl. The guy didn't even wait for us to sit down before he literally floored it out of the lot, throwing us back into our seats. He didn't ask which campground we were heading to or check our passes or anything. Instead, he immediately started preparing us with this really specific questions about our gear. He wanted to know if we had our weekend wristbands on us yet, if we had any high-end camera rigs in our bags, and if we were carrying cash for the vendor booths, since the local ATMs were all down apparently. My buddy tried to deflect a little bit, making a joke about us being broke students, but the driver, he just stopped talking completely at that moment. He didn't laugh, didn't reply, and just stared at us through the rearview mirror, his eyes shifting back and forth between the road and our reflection. He didn't take the state route toward the fairgrounds either. About 5 miles in, the pavement gave way to loose dirt, and he veered hard onto an unmarked gravel access road that ran parallel to a massive abandoned industrial limestone quarry. It was just miles and miles of rusted machinery, chain-link fencing, and overgrown weeds. He pinned the accelerator down along the gravel track, dust completely clouding the back windows until we couldn't see the highway anymore. My buddy caught my eye and suddenly unzipped his pocket, gripping a heavy metal flashlight that he'd packed. I reached down and unlocked my door handle, preparing to hit the dirt the second that the wheels slowed down, even if we were going 40 miles an hour. The driver, He swerved onto an old hollowed-out loading area behind a defunct stone-crushing mill. He slammed the brakes, throwing us forward against the front seats, and cut the ignition. The sudden silence in the van was truly terrifying, too. Right as the dust settled, a second car, a battered sedan with no plates, pulled out from behind a concrete barrier, blocking the narrow exit lane behind us. Two guys got out of the front seats, walking deliberately toward the van's side doors. They weren't moving fast, just steady, like they knew that they had all the time in the world. Before they could reach the handles, the absolute fluke of our lives happened. My buddy's phone suddenly vibrated. A random, delayed text notification from his dad had managed to punch through the dead zone, causing the phone to let out a loud, piercing emergency alert chime that he'd set up for family calls. Without hesitation, my friend grabbed the phone, slammed it against his ear, and started screaming at the top of his lungs into a completely dead line. "Yeah, Dad, we're right here. The shuttle driver took the quarry road by the old mill. We see your truck right at the entrance. Pull in right behind the burgundy van. We're right there." The driver's head snapped around so fast that I heard his neck literally pop. He looked at the phone, looked at the sedan blocking the lane, and must have assumed that a second vehicle full of people was literally turning into the gravel track behind him. He didn't say a single word. He cranked the engine, threw the van into reverse, and smashed straight into the front bumper of the sedan behind him, clearing just enough space to swing the wheel. He tore out of that quarry like the van was on fire, leaving the two other guys standing in a cloud of white limestone dust. He drove like an absolute psycho as well for the next 10 minutes, slammed the brakes outside of the main festival security point, and literally pushed our side bags out the side door before speeding off down the highway. We ended up talking to one of the local county deputies working the gate detail later that night. He didn't even look surprised. He told us that the abandoned quarry was a notorious dumping ground for interstate cargo thefts, and that crews regularly targeted stranded festival kids because they knew that they'd be carrying cash, electronics, and wouldn't be missed for days by their friends inside of the gates. To be honest, it completely ruined the weekend for us too. We ended up taking a regular licensed coach straight back home the next morning. So I had a bit of an unhinged experience with a rental place back in late 2024. This was a converted industrial loft space right near the shipyard in Baltimore. Huge steel frame windows, exposed brick, looked awesome on the paper lease, but the mechanical stuff, well, that started going sideways within the first week of me moving my mattress in. For me, it was the charge in the apartment. The place had these massive floor-to-floor iron columns that supported the old timber beams, and I started realizing that whenever I walked past the central pillar, the hairs on my arms would completely stand up, and the air would taste distinctly like copper pennies. If a truck passed by outside and the headlights swept across the brick, the shadows of that iron column wouldn't move with the light too. It would stay completely fixed to the brickwork, a dark, permanent vertical stripe that didn't match the angle of the windows at all. Then, the weight of things started shifting, but without making a sound. So I kept a heavy 70-pound iron anvil and a thick wooden block by the window that I used for leatherworking. I know, kind of random, but hey, that's who I am. I'd been sitting across the room on my laptop in total silence, and when I glanced over, the anvil would be sitting upside down. Not tipped over, but perfectly inverted, balanced flawlessly on its narrow horn. There were never any scuffs on the timber block underneath, and the dust on the floor hadn't even been disturbed from what I could make out. It was just suddenly reversed, as if the room had briefly forgotten which way gravity was supposed to pull. I would walk over to it, and that's when I would realize that it was sort of leaning against the wall, but still, how it got upside down like that is completely beyond me. My sister came down to stay over a weekend for a while as well, when she was looking for a job and she didn't even make it past midnight. She was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when she noticed the water in the toilet bowl was sitting level and the surface of the water was tilted at a sharp 15-degree angle, perfectly static, defying physics as if the entire building was sort of leaning down a steep hill, even though the floorboards under her feet were completely flat. She watched a drop of water from the faucet fall as well, in what she described as a diagonal line toward the edge of the sink basin instead of going straight down. She walked out of the bathroom, picked up her car keys, and literally just left without saying a word. I tried to stay personally because mostly I was broke, but the apartment started altering the air a bit, and by mid-November, the humidity inside became pretty intense, but only really ever in a 5-foot circle right in the center of the living room. If you stepped into that specific space, all the ambient noise from the street outside would completely vanish too, replaced by a sort of pressurized silence that made your ears pop, like being at the bottom of a deep swimming pool. The final straw for me, though, happened one morning. I was standing at the counter pouring cereal when the sound of the entire harbor outside, the foghorns, the gulls, the shipyard traffic, just instantly dropped away. I looked up and there were drops of water dripping from the leaky kitchen faucet, but they had stopped mid-air, like literally they were suspended there. There were about 6 individual droplets hanging in a perfect vertical line between the tap and the drain, completely suspended in space, vibrating slightly like they were caught in a spider web. As I stared at them, a thick dark grey grease started seeping out of the solid metal joints where the iron column met the ceiling. The grease, or I don't know, maybe it was a shadow, didn't drip down. It literally ran up the column, defying gravity, crawling straight toward the timber beams, and then disappearing sort of like between them and the roof. At that exact second, too, the glass in the massive steel frame windows turned completely opaque, frosting over with like just a thick film of some sort from the inside that completely blocked out all the daylight, plunging the room into complete darkness. Well, I didn't stick around to find out what the heck that was about. I grabbed my computer, my clothes, I left the keys on the counter, and I walked out into the hallway where the regular harbor sounds instantly slammed straight back into my ears. I left that place, called my sister, and trekked all the way to her place to stay with her for a while. Eventually, I went back with her to get my stuff, and thankfully while we were there nothing happened, but still, I had that distinct feeling of being watched the entire time that we were packing up. To give you some context, I'm a 26-year-old woman, best friend of S, also 26 years old. Since her childhood, strange things have been happening with her paternal family, and I have personally witnessed bizarre events on 3 occasions. My best friend S lives part of the year with her uncle on a piece of land where there is a mobile home. Surrounded by several houses and land belonging to her family, S is of Romani descent. She no longer has contact with her parents, who were abusive and abandoned their children, which explains why she's been living with her uncle for like several years now. Now, since she was young, S has told me about strange occurrences happening at her brother's or grandmother's and uncle's and even her parents' house. A very tall man sometimes appears at night and regularly watches them. These appearances occur randomly, whether it's raining, windy, snowing in summer or winter. This man, whose face is always unrecognizable, seems to stand in certain spots to spy on them late at night. At first glance, this could be dismissed as a case of stalking, I admit, but what is truly unsettling is that this man has been around for not just 1 or 2 years, but since the childhood of S's aunts and uncles. This man has been tracking them for generations, it seems. The strangest thing of all, though, is that every time someone tries to confront him, it's impossible to get close. The man seems to move away very quickly without running, and sometimes he completely disappears when he is actively searched for. For instance, S's cousin once tried to catch him, but whenever he went out with friends or uncles, this man had completely vanished. What makes this situation even more disturbing, though, is that whenever he appears, there is an intense feeling of discomfort that affects everyone, even those far from the area where he is seen. Now, the first time S saw him, she was 6 years old, and had gotten up to drink a glass of water. She saw a man standing very close to the patio door. To give you an idea of how tall he is, she could only see his shoulders, not his head. She called her mother, who also saw him and was frozen in fear. The family dog at the time began whining. After several minutes, this man backed away and hid or, well, disappeared. The second time, she was at her grandmother's house when she spotted a very tall, motionless man looking in the direction of one of her uncle's plots. Her cousin, who started having a panic attack, also noticed him too. Her uncles and father tried to approach him, but he quickly moved away without actually running. They still couldn't see his face when they got close too. And the third time was when I was with her at her uncle's place. She heard her dogs whining, and her uncle, who is usually a heavy sleeper, suddenly woke up, grabbed a baseball bat, and went outside trembling to confront this guy. But as soon as he stepped outside, the man seemed to evaporate into the vegetation. The land is a fairly wooded area. Now, here are some questions that I've received, and I'll try to give some answers to them. Why do they think it's the same man? Well, because of his height and the way that he flees. But what doesn't make sense is that it's been happening since the childhood of S's aunts and uncles, so this man should be very old by now. And that's really unsettling to think about, but he's never tried to approach anyone or talk or leave a message or anything. It's just really bizarre. What about the police? Well, they only called the police twice. Being from a Romani background, even though they are settled, they aren't always taken seriously by law enforcement. An investigation was opened at one stage, but it didn't lead to anything. Has no one ever managed to catch him? As mentioned earlier, never. And it's weird too that, despite attempts to chase or confront him and his disappearances, this man still seems to linger around. Why consider something supernatural? Well, S and some members of her family are almost convinced of it. First, because of his apparent age, and then because they have never been able to catch him. And despite the investigation, there were no footprints, no DNA, no signs of forced entry, nothing tangible, I guess you could say. What about photos or videos? At night, on land surrounded by forest and without streetlights or city lights, they tried, but you could barely see anything. Even the installation of surveillance cameras was a failure, which reinforced the theory that this man might not be human, well, according to them anyway. Personally, I am a believer and have seen strange things before, but what happens at my best friend's place from time to time is really frightening, especially the reactions of the dogs who seem to panic as soon as this man is around. This leads me to think that it might be a spirit or maybe a jinn haunting the area. S's favorite uncle thinks that it might not be the same man, but if it is, he's one heck of a degenerate or a pervert, is what he says, because to stalk a family for 40 years requires serious determination. So my question for all of you guys is, do you have any idea as to what this is, what his intentions might be, anything? Because that too remains a real mystery. My sister and I went to the beach yesterday since it's still warm out in New York and we wanted to get some sun. Since it's after Labor Day and schools are back in session, there are no lifeguards there and really it's pretty isolated. We arrived around 11 in the morning and there was a couple sitting near us, as well as a man who was walking in the sand with his headphones in. Around 1 p.m, the couple who was sitting near us left the beach. The man who was walking in the sand was still there, and further in the distance were two women sitting on their beach chairs. My sister was sitting in her beach chair, and I decided to lay on my stomach to get the back of my body more tanned. When all of a sudden I hear my sister say in a very fearful voice to me, "There's a man coming toward us." But the man who was walking the beach with his headphones in came walking toward us, swinging his arms back and forth. I immediately got up, and he was now on the edge of my beach blanket. Both my sister and I panicked in the moment and basically froze. I asked him if he needed something, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at my sister and me. My sister said, "Let's get our belongings and let's just go." We got off our beach blanket and we exited the beach, but the whole encounter really had my sister and I shaken up. I mean, I don't know what he was going to do to us, or if he would have been waiting for us in the parking lot or what. But the look in his eyes is something I'll never forget. We immediately contacted the police after this and we filed a report. Back in 2009, when I was 19, I was dating this girl who was 21. I was in college and living at home with my mum. My girlfriend and I had been together for about a year at this point. She had been invited to a co-worker's party in a nearby town. I wasn't feeling well that night though, so I decided to stay home. Now, to get from our town to the co-worker's town, you had to drive through a long stretch where it was just woods on both sides of you. I think it was late fall at that time, so it was getting darker earlier. She was driving home at around 7:30 or 8 o'clock when she called me from that wooded road just to chat along the way. But the call ended suddenly. You might be thinking the call got dropped because, well, she was driving through a wooded area, right? And that's what I thought too. She called back almost immediately. I answered the phone, but it wasn't her. It was a deep voice, but it was completely clear. What I mean by clear is that it wasn't like staticky or anything. To this day, I 100% maintain that it was not radio interference too. Anyway, the voice was deep, clear, and sounded urgent and angry. It was speaking in a language I've never heard before. It wasn't German, French, Romanian, Spanish, or whatever. It might be dramatic to say this too, but the voice didn't sound, well, human. I wish that I could somehow record my thoughts so that I could post the memory of this voice for all of you to hear, because it was just indescribable. I remember sitting there though. I was in my bedroom at the time, completely frozen, holding the phone to my ear. I eventually got up in a panic and ran to my mum in the living room. I handed her the phone and frantically said, "Please listen to this." But as soon as she put it to her ear, the phone hung up. Just like before, my girlfriend called back almost immediately. I hesitated to pick it up this time, but when I did, it was actually her. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "What the heck was that?" According to her, I'm the one that called her back, and when she picked up, she heard the same voice that I did. We're still on good terms to this day. We broke up maybe a year after this incident, but whenever we see each other, we're both like, "Remember that phone call that we had?" Whenever I bring it up, people say it's radio interference or I picked up another call somehow. I'm willing to accept a non-paranormal explanation if it's a good one, but it was definitely not radio interference, so do you have any other suggestions or thoughts? So I don't encounter much these days regarding the paranormal. However, I remember a distinct day as a kid that I'll never forget. My grandmother of Vietnamese descent used to tell stories of her ability to sense the presence of unearthly beings dating all the way back to her childhood. The earliest story that she recounts is walking home from school with her friends along an abandoned railroad in Vietnam. She recalled an old tale of a lantern shining in the distance that will lure you into following it, and described it as a trap that would intentionally lead you far away from where you were intending to go. Long story short, she and her friends began following this lantern that never seemed to get closer to them. This went on until it was dark outside, and she realized that she had been following this light for hours. She was told as a child about this phenomenon when she was younger, as I mentioned previously. Her parents told her that apparently the only way to rid yourself of this is to wipe urine onto your face. I know that sounds questionable at best, but these were her words. Apparently once they did that too, they snapped out of it. Fast forward to my childhood though, and her later years in the States, she claimed that there was a dark portal in the room attached to my childhood bedroom. I'm not sure why she chose to mention this at a family dinner of all places, but our family was very open about these things as my entire dad's side was practicing Buddhism and believed in these things. Well, one day when I was 14 or so, I decided to ditch summer camp and walk home. About 2 miles, I think, and I got home at around mid-afternoon. I shower and start watching the show Weeds on Netflix when I see my mum walk outside of my room towards the air conditioning control panel. She never turned to look at me or anything, didn't even acknowledge the fact that I was home when I wasn't supposed to be, let alone the fact that she wasn't at work for some reason. There was no exchange of words or anything. She then proceeds to walk towards the living room, away from my bedroom and hallway, only to find out hours later that the garage opens and she got back from work. She questioned why I was home and I told her. Also, I told her I literally saw her a few hours ago outside of my room, only to be told that she was never home. The figure, though, was definitely my mother, I mean, without a doubt, to the point that when I initially saw the figure, I had no anxiety or any fear, I just assumed that she was home or something. I mean, I was cozy watching my show, so I figured she wasn't trying to bother me. But no, she wasn't even there to begin with. I told my grandma this story a bit later, and she told me that she saw a version of my deceased grandmother in that hallway as well at one point. I never really believed in the paranormal. I certainly didn't believe my grandma's story. I mean, urine on the face and all that. But this story, it seriously still gives me goosebumps and honestly makes me question myself. So I moved with my mum to her new boyfriend's when I was 11. I'd experienced a few weird things in my life by this point. The house was very run down and outdated before my mum redecorated, and I was put in a nicely sized room in comparison to my old one. Younger siblings get the smallest, right? But like I say, it was very outdated. I'd had a few nights here and felt uneasy, I guess, but I assumed that was due to the drastic change me and my mum went through. I'd heard banging, running up the stairs, you name it. Anyway, it was day. I often caught glimpses of something through the crack of my door and had a look, but nothing was ever there. I got into the habit of looking through the crack and then entering my room. So I did just that, saw nothing through the crack and then entered my room. But I froze in place because there stood a woman with dark, permed hair. She was facing away from me, but I could tell that she was old by her arms and posture. She was stood near my window at the right side of my bed. Naturally, I was terrified and glad that I slept on the left. I ran down in a panic and screaming and told my mum that I saw an elderly lady in my room. She didn't quite believe me at first, but was freaked out too. We left it there so that we didn't scare ourselves too much. A few days passed and I walked in from school to my mum in the kitchen. She said that she'd spoken to the neighbor about me seeing an old lady in my room. The neighbor said how there was a lady that lived there before my mum's boyfriend moved in, and her bedroom was the one that I was staying in. And apparently, she had died in my bedroom and was discovered a few days later. So that was creepy. That didn't freak me out too much, I guess, as that is the case for most houses. What scared me, though, was when Mum asked me what color was her hair. I thought that it was weird that she asked me, but I said, funnily enough, she had dark hair instead of grey. Mum's face instantly dropped, and said the neighbor told her that she used to dye her hair dark into her later years. I didn't believe her and thought that she was just trying to freak me out, so I ended up trying to call her bluff. Mum tried to scare me most days for her entertainment, but she insisted the conversation happened. I was skeptical until my mum decorated my room. The wardrobe, It was full of old ladies' clothes and men's shoes, and under the carpet, and I swear that this is true, to the right of my bed by the window, there was a patch of decomposition staining. Gross, right? Safe to say my mum's boyfriend is gross, and I hated that room forever after. So I've been hesitant to share this, but I think it's time. What happened to me and my family in our old home, it still chills me to the bone. A few years ago, my family moved into a large old house that had been in my family for generations. It's a beautiful place with a lot of character, but from the moment that we moved in, something always felt off. The first sign was the constant feeling of just being watched. We would frequently hear footsteps when nobody was around, and doors would open and close on their own too. My parents brushed it off as the house settling or old plumbing and all that, but I certainly wasn't convinced. And one night, I was home alone while my parents were out. I was in the living room watching some TV when I heard someone calling my name from upstairs. Honestly, it sounded like my mum, but when I went up to check, the house was obviously empty. I called out but got no response. I checked every room, but nobody was there. A few nights later, while I was trying to sleep, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned around to find nothing but the dark, empty room. My heart was racing though, and I barely slept that night. The final straw came one evening though, when we were having a family dinner. A picture frame fell off the wall and shattered on the floor, and when we picked it up, the picture was of a woman that we didn't recognize. We had never seen her before, and she wasn't a relative. My parents did some research and found out that the woman had lived in the house decades before and had died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, we've had the house blessed and tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but the feeling of unease just never fully went away. I still wonder who or what was trying to communicate with us there, and I'm wondering if anybody else has experienced something like this. I would love to hear your thoughts, or if you have any advice on dealing with a haunting, because honestly, I have no idea. Let me start with a bit of a backstory. So about 9 months ago, I began working as a hospital security guard at a major hospital in my city. It's been the most exciting and enjoyable job that I've ever had. I'm incredibly grateful for it, as I've made many new friends and accumulated countless stories to share. The saying that if you love your job that you never work a day in your life really rings true for me here. I've had such a variety of experiences too, from arresting trespassers to dealing with mental health patients and searching for missing individuals, the list goes on. But those stories are for another day, because today I want to talk about something different, my experience with the paranormal. Before I started this job, I was already intrigued by the idea of paranormal activity in a major hospital. I mean, people pass away in hospitals every day, so you'd think that it would be a hotspot for ghostly encounters, right? I wish that I could say I've seen ghosts chasing me down the halls or bodies mysteriously moving on their own in the morgue, but honestly, nothing quite like that has ever happened. Still, I wouldn't be sharing this if I hadn't experienced anything at all. So to give you a better understanding of the hospital's layout, let me explain where security is stationed. There are 4 main buildings we cover. The first is the main hospital, which houses the emergency room and over 1,000 beds for both kids and adults. We typically have at least 8 guards handling calls in this building, with 1 guard stationed in the emergency room at all times, since that's where most calls come from. It's worth noting that I'm in Canada as well, so anyone can come to the hospital for, well, really any reason, free of charge. The second building, located across the street, is an 8-story medical clinic that requires just 1 guard. This guard also has to patrol the adjacent old clinical building, which is now primarily used for treating children with eating disorders. This is where the story I'm about to share takes place. The last building is the cancer clinic, which requires 2 guards at all times and is the closest to the medical clinic if assistance is needed. So when I first started the job and was shown around the various buildings, the old clinic, which we'll call the asbestos clinic due to its history of asbestos issues, immediately stood out to me. It's a building that, in my opinion, should have been demolished long ago, and during my initial walkthrough, a fellow guard told me that this building was haunted by a young girl who took her own life on the 2nd floor. He also mentioned that the basement was haunted. The whole building used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 50s and 60s, with tunnels in the basement that were once used to transport bodies. Now, about a month ago, it was my turn to work at the clinic during a night shift, and I was determined to experience some paranormal activity. I had done countless patrols of the asbestos clinic before, but nothing much had happened, aside from the elevators occasionally opening on their own, which was apparently normal. But that night, things changed. I had heard plenty of stories from other guards about strange occurrences in the clinic, but I had never experienced anything myself. I decided to do my patrol at 3 in the morning, which is often said to be the prime time for paranormal activity. I began my patrol by walking around the exterior of the building, checking all the entrances to ensure that they were locked. The building closes relatively early, around 8 p.m, so by then it should be completely empty. However, I noticed that one of the exterior doors was slightly open. This concerned me because it had been closed during my first patrol. The building doesn't have any interior cameras, so when something like this happens at night, I have to check every unlocked room inside to make sure that nobody is inside. I entered the building and started my patrol of the 1st floor, checking every door and hallway. Nobody was there. As I approached the elevator to go up to the 2nd floor, though, I heard a faint creaking sound, like a door opening. At that, I immediately radioed my team lead, informing her that I had found an open door and was hearing noises. I told her that I was going to conduct a thorough patrol, and she sent one of the guards from the cancer clinic, Fred, to assist me. After searching the 1st floor again and finding nothing, Fred arrived. He told me that he would start searching the 3rd and 4th floors while I covered the 2nd floor and basement. As I was searching the 2nd floor, I heard the same creaking noise again, the sound of a door opening, I think. I radioed Fred to come down, still not considering the possibility of anything paranormal. We've had incidents of homeless people breaking in to find a place to sleep, and though it's rare for them to target the asbestos clinic since it's usually locked, it has happened before. We searched every room on the 2nd floor, but in the end we found nothing. After thoroughly checking the entire clinic, we concluded that nobody was inside. Fred returned to the cancer clinic, and my team lead made a joke that it was probably just a ghost. And that got me thinking, this might be the perfect time to continue my ghost hunting. So I went back into the building, determined to capture some activity. I sat down in a chair on the 2nd floor, and I began waiting to see if anything would happen. After about 10 minutes of nothing, I got bored and I decided to head down to the basement. Now, the basement is an eerie place, let me tell you, filled with tunnels that mostly lead to nowhere now. I decided to explore one of them since I had never done it before, and this seemed like the perfect time. Once I exited the elevator, I made my way to one of the locked doors leading to the longest tunnel. Most of the tunnels were completely blocked off, but this one stretched on and on. I unlocked the door and ventured down the tunnel, taking note of my radio beeping to indicate that it had lost signal, a common issue in the basement areas here. As I reached the end of the tunnel, my flashlight started to flicker. I decided to stand still and listen for a bit, and to my shock, I heard a blood-curdling female scream coming from the start of the tunnel. At that, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around, pointing my flickering flashlight back toward the entrance, and started running toward the scream. When I reached the entrance, I tried to radio my team lead, but my radio was still out of signal. I looked around the basement and noticed that one of the doors was open. This door was supposed to be locked, which only security have access to the keys for. I looked inside of the room, but nobody was there. My heart was racing, obviously, and so I closed the door and headed back upstairs to get a radio signal. I was still unsure if I had experienced something paranormal or if somebody had actually broken in, but once I got back to the main floor, I radioed my team lead to let her know what had happened. She sent Fred back to help me investigate the source of the scream. When we arrived, we went back to the basement. I showed him the room that had been opened, and we both noticed a very distinct and strong smell, something like that of a decomposing body. Having spent time in the hospital morgue, I was all too familiar with that smell, and we searched the room, but we couldn't find anything. Fred joked that the room might have been used for tuberculosis patients who didn't make it, but in truth, none of us were sure what that room had been used for. We determined that everything was fine, and I decided that I'd spend enough time in the asbestos clinic for one night. Ever since that experience, though, I've sort of rushed through my patrols in that basement, as that smell still lingers every time I pass that room. So, what do you think? Was this a paranormal experience or something else? Should I investigate further, or should I just let it be? My first experience with the paranormal was actually a string of experiences. I was 16 and my family had just moved into a new home. Honestly, I really loved that house too. I had my own room that I picked myself, and I didn't feel any kind of hesitance while unpacking and decorating to make myself feel more at home. Everything was great. At least for the first week, that is. After school, I would get home with my little brother about an hour before my mum. And one day, I was the first one into the home. I threw my bag onto the kitchen table and found my cat stood frozen, staring at a door in the kitchen that led to our garage. I spoke to my cat. "Hey, what are you doing?" I walked towards him, but before I could touch him, a woman's scream came from the garage, and my cat literally sprinted from the room. I followed at that, taking my little brother with me outside and calling my mum. My brother insisted that he didn't hear anything though, and my mum suggested that I must have imagined it, but I knew that it was real because, well, my cat reacted like that. Once my mum got home, we checked the house to find nothing. She suggested that I was stressed and watching too many scary movies. I didn't bother to argue any further. I could tell that I wasn't going to be believed, so I grabbed my bag and walked to my bedroom at the end of the hall. I stood in the doorway, freezing in my tracks. My closet door was slid open and hanging from its track, as if someone had tried to pull it off, and my pillow was standing in the middle of the room, a flat, flimsy pillow that I couldn't get to stand even if I wanted to. I yelled for my mum. "Someone's been in my room," I accused. She came back, my little brother trailing behind her. I pointed in the room, only to find the pillow now laying flat, as it should have been the whole time. "You must have knocked it off the bed when you woke up this morning." She brushed it off, but I knew that I hadn't, and even if I had, how was it standing like that? I played with the pillow for like several minutes, trying to mimic the position that it had been in, but I just couldn't get it to happen again. I mean, it just seemed impossible to me. I went to bed that night without a problem, and while I did think that what had happened earlier that day was strange, I didn't lose too much sleep over it, but I was prone to waking throughout the night, so, like clockwork, I awoke around 3 in the morning and got up to go to the bathroom. When I returned to my doorway and to my bedroom, I froze. The light from the bathroom shined just barely into my room, making it impossible to miss because I could see a figure sitting on the edge of my bed. It had no features, just the shadow of a large man. I leaned forward, squinting my eyes, trying to adjust my vision to the darkness of my room, but before I could move any further, the figure stood and instantly charged at me. I have never screamed so loud. My feet came out from under me and I hit the floor, my hand flipping on the light before I had lost my balance. And when I looked again, nothing was there. My mum and brother were there in an instant, wondering why I was screaming and now crying on the floor. I tried to explain, but you were dreaming, my mum told me. I was awake, I was up. I tried to argue, but she just shook her head. You must have been dreaming, she insisted. Go back to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, surprisingly, went fine. That is, until I was back home from school. That house suddenly didn't feel like home to me, and my room did not feel like mine anymore. I felt like I was invading somebody else's space, and I was sort of apologetic. I then attempted to make a Ouija board out of cardboard and a clear bottle cap, because I was desperate to confirm my own experiences. Hello, I said quietly, waiting for a response. Nothing. I'm sorry if we've moved into your home. I'll be a good roommate. I'm very clean. I began to ramble, but the bottle cap, it never moved. I started to feel silly looking down at the makeshift board. It was just trash, really, and so I pushed it away and climbed into bed, embarrassed that I believed such a thing would even work. That night, I heard something rattling around, though. I initially thought that it was a large house moth or something knocking itself onto my window. I flipped on my bedside lamp and noticed that the board on the floor, only the bottle cap was standing on its side, spinning like a quarter in fast circles. I let out a breath of air in disbelief, and the cap dropped, once again motionless. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the board, tearing it in half and shoving it in the trash. I kept my lamp on for about an hour before I started to feel tired again. Reluctantly, I flipped the lamp off and I drifted to sleep. I always slept with a blindfold on, irritated by the smallest bit of light, so when I awoke again feeling the cold air of my fan, I assumed that I had kicked my blanket off in my sleep. I felt around the bed, trying to find it to cover myself again, but no luck. I lifted my blindfold and I was horrified to see my blanket standing tall above me. It had to have been about 6 feet, towering over my body. I moved quickly, attempting to throw my feet to the side and run to the door, but the blanket fell, and I was forced back to my mattress, a weight suddenly suffocating me, as if somebody had just laid on top of me. I gasped for breath, trying to scream, but not a sound would escape my throat. I remember my eyelids fluttering as I lost consciousness from the lack of air eventually. That morning, I awoke with my blindfold lifted, my blanket tossed to the side of the bed, and pain taking over my body. I knew that I hadn't imagined it, and I came out of my room and I just couldn't stop myself from crying when I found my mum getting ready for work in the bathroom. I tried to explain, but again she didn't believe me. She never believed me, in fact. You were dreaming, she said to me. You can stay home from school today. Try and get some rest. I reluctantly nodded and I went back to bed, still scared to really go back to sleep, but I laid stiff and waited for the sound of my mum and brother leaving for the day. I heard the keys jingle and the door close. I was now alone in the home. I rolled into my stomach and cried into my pillow. I was exhausted, in pain, and scared. For several minutes, I laid there crying, and then something happened. I'm sorry about your mum, a man's voice said, clearly beside me. I gasped and sat straight up, but no one was there. I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle being alone there anymore. So I got out of bed and walked myself to school, something I was usually too scared to do, but not nearly as scared as I was of whatever was in my home. We moved out of the home shortly after due to my mum getting married, and all related activities stopped, much to my relief, but I'll always wonder what it was and why it only seemed to interact with me. That was the first and strongest presence that I've ever encountered. I live in a rural area with my elderly grandfather and am his primary caretaker. We have very few neighbors, no sidewalks, a small town. We have very few break-ins or really any crime in general in this area. A lot of wooded areas and farmland. My house is surrounded by woods and has a tree line separating us from our neighbors. I have extensive firearm training and also have worked as a firearm instructor in the past. So, last Friday, I'm sitting in my basement on my couch about to go to sleep. This is a pretty regular occurrence for me. My couch sits in front of a big window, the blinds always closed, and a glass door that leads outside, covered with a semi-transparent shade. You can see through it, but just barely, enough to make out a silhouette if you need to. Now, it was about almost 11 p.m. and I was watching a movie with headphones on when I thought that I heard a noise outside, which is a bit weird considering that I was wearing headphones with the volume up pretty high. So I took off the headphones to listen more closely. I heard what sounded like footsteps in the gravel driveway just outside of my door, but not walking, more like, I don't know, dancing or maybe sprinting, like they were moving very fast. At the time, I got up and looked out the glass door and I saw nothing, so I chalked it up to just being an animal. I sat back down on the couch and was about to put my headphones back on when I heard 3 distinct taps on my window, just opposite my couch. Naturally, I'm a bit startled by that because no one I know is going to do that. They would call me or just knock on my door, especially this late at night. As I stand up again, I hear the gravel in the driveway rustling again, this time louder and as if somebody is running away. The direction that I heard them running is directly into a briar patch and densely wooded area. So I grab my rifle that I keep in the closet just beside the basement door, and I step outside. Using the flashlight attached to the rifle, I scan the tree line looking for possible threats because I'm convinced at this point that some people are here to rob me. I see nothing and go back inside thinking that maybe still, probably more trying to convince myself that it could have been an animal of some sort. At this point, I turn off all the lights inside and just sort of stand behind the glass door with the shade, with the outside floodlights on. This way I could see outside and nobody could see in, just sort of watching. I was making sure everything was okay before I had to go to bed. It's extremely quiet outside, like in scary movies when they say even the bugs and the birds are silent. That was now occurring. Not a cricket or a locust, not anything was making a sound. As I'm almost ready to give up and say it was just my imagination, I see a flicker of light in the woods in front of me. If I had to guess, it was maybe the size of a dime, like a reflection of my house lights into metal or something, followed by the bushes rustling. So, once again, I step outside and yell, "Hey," seeing if I could scare who or whatever it was away. And that was when I hear a loud whisper. That's the best way that I can describe it anyway. It was a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear it from about 100 feet away say, "Hey," back to me. I'm freaked out because I now realize that it's another person. So I shoulder my rifle, point the mounted flashlight back into the woods again, and yell back to them, "Wrong house, dude. Get out of my property unless you want to die tonight," or something along those lines. At that moment, to my right, I hear a person whistle softly. It sounded kind of like they were mimicking a bird, 2 soft whistles, coming from the same tree line just further to the right. At that point, I turn and aim my rifle about 20 feet short and to the left of the tree line, not in the exact direction of the noises in case it was just some dumb kids just pulling a prank or something, and fire 5 shots into the ground to scare whoever it was away. I kept the flashlight pointed at the tree line, scanning for any movement. My neighbor's dog started barking, I assume at the gunshots. I never saw any movement, anyone scattering, never heard footsteps running away, nothing at all. So I walked down to the right side where the whistle came from. The woods are not as dense there as there are no briar bushes there, and I continued to look through the woods looking for any sign of people, I guess, but I still never saw anyone. As I'm walking back up to my house, wondering what the heck just happened, my grandfather, 84, meets me at the door asking me what had happened. He is still of sound mind, but just not so much physically. So I explained to him what had happened, loaded his revolver and set it by his bedside, in case someone tried to break in during the night. We sleep on opposite ends of the house and on separate floors, so I thought that this was the safest option. After I get him back to bed, I go to the upstairs kitchen and I get a bottle of water from the fridge. As I close the refrigerator door, I hear footsteps, but this time on the roof of our 2-story home. The lowest point of our roof would require a ladder to access it. I mean, an Olympic high jumper couldn't make that leap. My whole body is covered in chills at this point. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up. Utter fear is the best way to explain it. My grandfather, being almost deaf, of course didn't hear it, and I'm sure he was already back asleep anyway, but I instantly froze, listening. The footsteps were heavy, grown man-sized at least. They were walking slowly from his room to the kitchen area where I'm at. There's a skylight on the roof of the kitchen, so I remain still and look up towards it, praying that nothing would be looking back at me. I waited a few minutes, the footsteps continued, back and forth from one side of the house to the other. I decided to run back downstairs, and quickly I grabbed my rifle and run outside, not knowing at this point who or what I'm dealing with, just relying on my training to be able to neutralize the threat if I need to. I try to calm myself, focusing on controlling my breath, as I go to the front yard and begin to scan the roof with my weapons-mounted flashlight. Again, I see nothing. I walk around the house, scanning the trees and the roof for any signs of anyone or anything, but I saw nothing. I repeated this twice, yelling out a few times, "I don't know what you are, but you better get the heck out of here." And eventually I just gave up. Returning inside to watch some TV with my rifle in hand all night now, I sat there and really, that was the end of it. No weird or unnatural occurrences since that night. Needless to say, the last few nights have been a bit rough for me with little to no sleep. I'm still unsure exactly what happened, and I mean, I've never had any hallucinations before. I'm not sure even hallucinations could be that real. I had told some family and friends what had happened, and they all kind of brushed it off. They said that I could have imagined the footsteps, or the whistle could have been a bird. It was kids playing a prank, stuff like that. But I just am not so sure about that. All of this has left me wondering a few things. Am I crazy? Did I actually hallucinate all of it? If I did, why did the hallucinations only last for like one night? Could it have been an extremely well-executed prank? Well, I guess. Although I'm really not sure who would have done that and not have jumped out with cameras after or something, announcing that it was a prank. The whistle could have been a bird noise, sure. I'm not a bird expert by any means. But the loud whispering of hay or the distinct loud footsteps on the roof afterward, I really don't think birds can speak or are like 200 plus pounds. Anyways, that's my story. It's the first possible cryptid encounter that I've ever had, or paranormal or whatever. I've experienced some weird, unexplainable things in my past, but I'm definitely a skeptic at best as far as paranormal things go. But that encounter, it definitely freaked me out and has me questioning things, even now. My 10-year-old daughter, well, she sleep talks. Sometimes she'll even sit up and look around a bit. And last night, she dozed off on the couch, and 15 minutes later, she sat up and said, "Where did it go?" I said, "It's okay, honey, go back to bed." She laid down and asked me again where it went. I said, "Go back to sleep." And then I immediately heard a man's voice right in front of me say no. I looked at my daughter and she was asleep again. My husband was in another part of the house in our bedroom asleep, and honestly, I'm still very shaken. There was a man who passed away in our living room in 2017. There was also a man who shot his wife in the head with a shotgun in 1986 in the driveway across the street. We also live by a cemetery, like next door I mean. I never really felt spooked as well until, well, last night, and I haven't slept. The voice was so aggressive, and I just hate this so much. It was close and it was real. I don't know how else to explain it. I've asked my daughter if she ever has dreams about ghosts or sees ghosts, but she said no. I asked if she thought the house was haunted, and she said, well, there are the dimes. I forgot about the dimes. Apparently they fall on her. She has so many dimes now because of this too. We rarely use cash though, and she has a reloadable cash card, so we have no idea where they came from. Like, for instance, she'll be in the kitchen and I'll hear a coin hit the floor. She'll say, thanks, Jeff, and put it in her bank in her room, and I honestly forgot about all that. I didn't tell her what happened last night because, quite honestly, I think it will terrify her. The dogs too, we have 3 boxer dogs that heard it as well. When I told my husband about what had happened, he asked me if that's why the girls woke him up scratching at the bedroom door trying to get out. They usually all pile in bed with us. I heard them scratching at the door, but not until much later, and I had gotten up after my heart calmed down and decided to go pee once more before crashing for the night. The dogs, though, they never do this. They go to bed when he goes to bed, and they stay there all night. Also, just now my daughter actually said to me, do you think people can talk to ghosts? Do consider that we went to the new Beetlejuice movie after school yesterday, so that could be related, but I said, well, anything's possible. My grandpa always said, if someone said that they saw this or that, never dismiss it because, well, you just never know. My daughter then said, isn't he the grandpa that worked in the Air Force at Roswell's, the alien place? I said, yeah, Roswell. She asked, did he believe in aliens and ghosts? I replied, oh, yeah, he had an author that he loved that talked about supernatural encounters all the time. I cannot remember his name, but my grandma would say that he was crazy when he'd bring this sort of thing up. She said, well, she wasn't lucky enough to see that sort of stuff, I guess. I said, why do you ask? And she said, oh, I was just curious. Also, Jeff, the man who died in our house, he was a nice guy and a bit of a family friend. We've always said Jeff jokingly, and we've agreed that if he were to do anything, that he's obviously nice, if he's leaving us money. The voice I heard was forceful though, and almost angry. Nothing has happened since then, and my daughter has seemed unfazed. I've also been sleeping a lot better. Well, after a couple of days, that is. So, a little bit of context is that, at the time of this, I was actually being pimped out by my partner. It was early nighttime, and I was getting ready for work. There were ad posters for me on a couple of different sites, and we had snagged what we thought could be a big fish. I messaged this John for about half an hour before agreeing on a house call. The house was completely across the street, in a very wealthy neighborhood. The John told me to let me know when I arrived. He was working on his PC in an upstairs bedroom or something. My partner and I got into the car and drove to the address provided. He always waited nearby while I worked, but when we arrived to this house, we both felt, well, really uneasy. I messaged the John once I was in the driveway, to no response. I got out and started to approach the door, and my partner came with me. The door was large and made of heavy wood, with a fancy frosted glass window in the center. When I knocked, I realized that it was actually ajar. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly pushed the door open wide. The interior of the house confused me further, though. I was faced with a short hallway leading into a grand living space. There was a beautiful fireplace in the center, complete with a crackling fire going. To my left, I noticed a dark doorway. But the strangest thing of all was the lack of furniture. From the front door where I stood, I could see nearly the entire living room. There wasn't even a single chair. No photos on the wall, nothing but the fire in the fireplace. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment. My partner stepped past me into the house. I started to flee, but curiosity and fear kept me locked in place. He stepped forward and looked into the doorway to the left. He recoiled a bit and shouted, "Hello, hello," a few times. He turned to me and shoved me out of the doorway, and at this point, I found my legs again and sprinted to the car. We drove in stunned silence for a moment until we stopped at an all-night pharmacy. I asked softly, "What was in that room?" He said, very slowly, "An air mattress with 2 people on it, sleeping. Well, I hope." This is something that I experienced at and below the age of 6. It's something that I still think about now as a 37-year-old and have some vivid memories of. So, in the first house I lived in, I shared a room with my older brother. It was a small house with tiny rooms, so we slept in bunk beds with me on the bottom. My parents are somewhere on the hoarder spectrum, and as such, there was a lot of stuff packed into our small room. One item in particular was a stuffed Afghan dog that my mum had made. At the time, it felt like it was huge, and it had a very distinct, pointy face with plastic eyes glued on. It was actually stuffed with old tights and made a distinct noise when you moved it. My mum called it Arabella Afghan, and she stayed at the bottom of my bed with some other toys. To add a bit more context too, I was born in 1987. My maternal grandfather died in 1985, and as such never met any of his grandchildren. I remember my mum speaking about him a lot as a kid, saying how old he would have been when his birthday came around and generally telling us about him. I know that she missed him a lot, and she said to me one day that she had regretted not telling him she loved him before he died. Now, I'm not suggesting that this definitely happened, as I know that the imagination of a child can be very active. However, the events that I'm about to tell you at least felt real to young me. So with all that said, here's what happened. Arabella, she would come to life in the night. I would hear the distinct noise of her moving and bury my head under my pillow so that I wouldn't see her, or she wouldn't see me, and just wait until the noise stopped. One night in particular, though, I woke up and felt like I just wanted to be with my parents, so I got out of bed, made myself as small as possible with my eyes shut, and waited for the noise to stop so that I could run to my parents' room. On this occasion, though, a man's voice said, "You're a good boy," then the noise stopped, and I was absolutely terrified, and I ran. Another night, I heard the noise and looked over the end of my bed. Arabella was looking directly at me, which terrified me, so I immediately hid under my covers. I can still picture exactly how it looked in my mind's eye, too. Her plastic eyes locked with mine. On one very distinct occasion, I remember playing in my room by myself and a man's voice saying something like, "Don't worry," or "You're okay," although there was no one there. My dad was in the Air Force too and spent a lot of time away when I was very young, and during this time I'm fairly sure that he was in the Falklands and there was no other man in the house. I also remember saying to my mum one day, "Sometimes I hear God talking to me," which must have been where my young brain went to make sense of it all. But it's not really something that I talk about to people. This place, though, felt like it was somewhere that I could talk about it from a neutral standpoint. I do like to think that it was connected to my grandfather in some way, not least because it would have come from a place of love for my brothers and mother, especially seeing as I never got to meet him, but to be honest, I really don't know. So I used to be a paranormal investigator as a hobby, and thought that I'd share my most memorable encounter with all of you guys. Now, there was a house in Corinth, New York that I investigated several times, partially because we got more interesting stuff there than anywhere else, but mostly because the woman living there was scared of her daughter. She thought that she might be possessed due to her change in behavior, sudden mood swings, depression, all of that. This family's home had been in their name for generations, and they knew of 2 people who had died in the home. They also believed that, well, many years ago, somebody had performed some type of witchcraft in the attic. Anyway, let me get to the specific encounter. So my team and I were in the kitchen with her doing an EVP session. We didn't feel much of a presence, and we're getting ready to wrap up the session when Suddenly, the temperature under the table that we were sitting at felt like it dropped 20 degrees at least. I had a one-touch thermometer with me, so I quickly scanned the air above and below the table, and sure enough, there was a stark difference in the temperature. This woman's mother was one of the people who had passed in the home. In fact, she had died right in the kitchen that we were sitting in, so I looked at the woman and told her that I had a feeling that her mother might be with us, and asked if she had anything she wanted to ask her or anything she wanted to say to her. She started talking. I don't recall much of what she said, but the things I don't remember are sort of irrelevant to this anyway, because what I do remember was when she suddenly paused, looked up and said very softly, "Do you remember that squirrel we used to feed every day? Do you remember what we called him?" Long story short, I reviewed the audio about a week later, after she asked that question. I could see that there was an audio fluctuation, so I queued it up and listened with headphones on full blast to see if I could hear what was said, and it sounded like Nuthead. It took me a few times listening to it to decide that that was definitely what I was hearing, and well, I went back to the house a few days later to go over the evidence that we captured with her. There was other stuff, but not as compelling, but when we got to this audio clip, I took out a piece of paper and wrote Nuthead on it and hid it so nobody could see. I played the clip for her and asked her to tell me what she heard. After playing the clip, this woman just literally broke down in tears. Instead of waiting for a response with regards to what she had heard, I put the piece of paper down in front of her for her to read, and she started bawling even harder. Because Nuthead was apparently the name that her mother had coined for this squirrel. We talked to her mother that day in that kitchen. It's pretty wild to think about, and I still get goosebumps as I write about it now. This was probably 20 years ago now, but it's something that has stuck with me all this time. I want to preface by saying that I'm definitely a skeptic. I've had a few different experiences in my life, but this is the only one that I can't definitively logic my way out of. And it's a bit of a long story too, so please bear with me. Now, before I joined the military, I lived in South Florida, about 40 miles south of Tampa. It was around my sophomore year of high school, and we just moved into a new house, and I was a very tired kid. I need to include as well that I was on ADHD and antidepressant medication, as that's the only way that I can explain part of this, but the side effects included drowsiness and, well, go figure, nightmares. It started with almost nothing, to be honest. My dog would walk into my room and I'd say hi, and she'd almost immediately sprint out. One time she just stared at my closet and sort of shook. She's a rescue, so I just assumed at the time that it was some form of anxiety. If she did stay in my room though, she hated getting on my bed, and if she did, she'd get off after maybe a minute or two, even if I was petting her. After a couple of months, so maybe around Christmas, things started to change though. I'd come home almost every single day and crash in my room for an hour or two, and during this time I started to have very vivid, even realistic nightmares. The nightmares would start like I was waking up or still lying in bed, and I'd feel my head was super fuzzy, like I was lightheaded all of a sudden. I'd try to sit up and feel crushing weight on my chest. If I wrestled free, I'd try to get out of bed, but all I could do was sit up, like my legs just wouldn't work. I even remember being able to shimmy my way forward like I was crawling out of bed, and something pulled me back into it rather aggressively. This continued for about a month or two, and that's when things got worse. The nightmares evolved to something much worse. So, you know how in dreams you often recognize a place, but it doesn't really at all look like the place? This isn't one of those times. In fact, every detail of my room was exactly how it was normally, only I wasn't dreaming from my perspective, I was sort of looking in. It was a out-of-body experience, I guess you could say, and I would be standing in the middle of my room seeing myself sleep. If my room was messy and, let's say, a red shirt was on the ground before I went to sleep, it was in that exact spot in the nightmare. Backpack by the door, posters on the wall, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, during these nightmares, I'd watch my comforter compress on my chest and feel my breathing become hindered. I'd watch my head on my pillow as it jolted and could feel something hit my face. This particular instance would go on until I graduated high school. Almost every time, my mum would ask why I was such a rough sleeper, because I'd always have red marks on my neck or scratches somewhere. One time, it was so distinct on my neck, I could count the fingers or the marks from them. Ever since I joined the military, and I've been on my ship or my apartment, I've never had any experiences like that, even when I visit my home. I will say this though, I've noticed that my dog, to this day, will not stay in my room for very long at all. My house has been in my family for around 2 generations now, so it's a little bit old. Maybe 80 years, I would guess. Probably more, though. Anyway, everyone who lives or has lived or stayed for an extended period of time in my house has experienced something unexplainable that we just chalk up to ghosts. My family, they're pretty spiritual too, or just enough where it's above the normal person. As in, we sage and use incense to cleanse when the vibes get bad. We're open to the thought of ghosts and spirits and all that stuff. And stuff like give to the universe and you get back, that sort of thing. But that's pretty boring, and I'm moving soon to a brand new house that's been built, so I'm going to lose all the ghost buddies that have terrorized or taken care of me my whole life. And so I thought that I would share some of the highlights that I've had here. So, laying in bed one night, late, and trying to get to sleep, I have my foot out of my covers and slightly hanging off of the bed, when something grabs it and pulls. I get tugged literally off of my bed, and my bed moved a whole half a meter. I was obviously scared beyond belief because nobody was in my room, and before that my dog literally refused to come into my room. I just slowly went back onto my bed, curled up into a ball under my covers, and didn't sleep that night. On another night, I go back into my back area or laundry to see my brother's ex-partner standing at the top of the stairs looking pale and terrified as she calls out for my brother. I come up from behind her and ask what she's doing. She jumps a bit but calms down, and eventually my brother comes back upstairs. My yard is pitch black at night, so I assumed that she was wondering where he was or something. Until later when I found out that apparently she saw an old-looking lady in like a Victorian-style dress near the tree in my backyard, just sort of standing there. Everyone in my house has had some sort of an experience of her. My experience with her is I was getting clothes off of the line and she was just there, staring at me. I nearly had a heart attack when I saw her, but anyway, another night I entered my room and it was really hot that night, like boiling hot, but it was winter. I'm Australian, living in a tropical area, so I'm used to the heat, but in the winter it never really goes above like 20 degrees Celsius, which is freezing for me, and I had a really negative and sort of heavy atmosphere all of a sudden. I was so tired and it was after work, so I just said, yo, you can like get out of here right now, it's not the right time and all that sort of thing. And after a couple of seconds, my room cooled down and just sort of went back to normal, like a drastic temperature change over a few seconds. On another occasion, I was in my shower one time at like 11 p.m. when I heard my mum laughing right outside of the door. I sort of froze and went dead silent because she usually goes to sleep at like 8 p.m. After a couple of seconds of silence, I hear footsteps walking away from the door into my backyard. Then I hear my dog absolutely book it through my laundry. Bathroom is in the laundry, mind you. Down the stairs and start barking and screaming her head off. She has 3 types of barks. Her playful, high-pitched one, her warning one when someone's just walking down the street, and then her guard dog one that's loud, deep, and terrifying. And she was definitely in her guard dog mode. My younger sister has a lot of stories of her toys just sort of flying off the shelves in her old room, and back when I was in that room, the same thing had happened. What also happened though was the closet. That room is the only one with a built-in closet. It's also the smallest room, but it was opening and closing throughout the night. And let me tell you guys, I'm currently 16 and I still struggle to open and close it, since the little slidey bits are all rusted and the door is really heavy. As a child, my grandfather died. Great-grandfather, we just call him Grandpa though, and after his funeral I was sitting on my bed and crying to myself because, well, I missed him. Plus, this was my first experience with mortality like this. Two people enter my room and start comforting me. I recognized one was my grandpa, but I had absolutely no clue who the second person was. That was until a couple of years later I saw a photo of my grandma, Grandpa's wife, and realized that it was her. She died before I was even born. All my life I've been told that she's my guardian angel and is the reason why I get into so much deathly situations and always come out alive and completely okay. My middle name is her name, which is a nice little thing, but her name is my middle name because when I was born, like a couple of hours after, when my grandpa got to see me, I apparently gave him a look that my grandma used to give him all the time, and he went, "Man, she looks like her," or something like that. So they made my middle name her name. At night, you would always hear footsteps walking down my hall. Either it's the house settling or it was definitely somebody walking. Something was going on for sure, and most of the time you could hear the distinct footsteps. Sometimes I would also hear the sound of my dead dog crying. That kind of freaked me out, but if I have my hand hanging off of my bed at night, I could always feel someone holding it. Not doing anything bad, but they would just hold it. Sometimes I would also feel that feeling of someone brushing their thumb over my knuckles. It was kind of nice, I guess. It's not nice, however, when I get the feeling of hot breath on my hand. My house is 2 stories. The story has the formerly front room, which is now my brother's room and my pop's workshop. We live upstairs, about 8 or so meters up. I'm not great at estimating though, so yeah, I think it's about 8 meters. But the tapping at the windows is especially weird, and I really hate it. I also hear knocks on my door all the time. I know better than to open my door when I hear 3 knocks, but sometimes I hear rapid, loud knocking on my door, and when I open it, there's never anything there, which is very weird. And the final little thing about my house, which is more sad than scary, I guess, but my pop died last month, and he spent a lot of time under the house in his workshop doing stuff since he was a builder. Nobody can go under there now since there's a heavy feeling of being watched down there. Not watched in a bad way, but just sort of watched, like somebody is observing you. Honestly, I hope he is watching over us, but I also hope that he was able to pass on peacefully. Anyways, that's some stuff that has happened in my house that I can remember, and I hope that if you've listened to the end here that you've enjoyed it. I mainly write this for myself since I get really paranoid the moment that ghosts and stuff are brought up. This is like exposure therapy, I guess you could say, confronting my fears or like acknowledging it. I don't know, but it felt good, and I hope this helps me feel peaceful at night at the very least. And I hope it didn't have just the opposite effect and I won't be able to sleep again tonight. So, wish me luck. So I'm like 10, maybe 11. But either way, my family had recently moved into this house right at the bottom of the Appalachian Mountains. We bought this house from a widow whose husband had passed away in what had been the TV room, but we converted it into a library and stereo room for a custom setup my dad had built about maybe 4 years ago that he was extremely proud of. My brother is 14 or 15 at this time, and we were military brats. My dad had just retired from the Coast Guard, hence why we were living as far away from the ocean as we could. Given that we were under the impression this kind of place is crime-free, and we were used to my brother looking after me, our parents were okay with leaving us home alone. So, it's Saturday or something. We're home alone, and I'm at a risk of being bored out of my skull, so my brother decides to put on some music. He puts on the Cranberries, his favorite band, and starts teaching me to loosen up and just dance a bit. So we're in the music room dancing to the Cranberries' greatest hits, truly a hit down at the club. When it gets to, I think, Linger or Free to Decide, I honestly cannot remember which, but it was about 2000 to 2001, so it wasn't the '08 version of the greatest hits. I know it wasn't Zombie, but anyway, my brother and I are dancing when we hear an old man that we'd never heard, in the grouchiest voice ever, shout, "Would you turn that stuff off?" And we froze, staring at each other. We'd both heard it, absolutely clear as day, as if he'd been in the room with us. We freak out, turn off the music, and we spend the next 2 hours scouring the roughly 2 acres of land that we had for any sign that someone had been there. There were no signs of any cars, all the windows were closed, no sign that the adamantly unlocked doors had been open, and neither our dog nor our cat were perturbed in any way. Absolutely nothing. We decided that it was a ghost in the end and joked that it was Old Man H, the man who had apparently died in that room. And my brother decides that the best thing that we can do is show the ghost that this is our house now and we'll play whatever music we damn well please. And so we finish the album. Not that much dancing this time though. Anyway, we talk about it a couple of times over the next decade or so once in a while, and we've got a cool ghost story to tell, right? So fast forward about 12 years, my brother had graduated from college and I'm in college, having gone through the ringer a couple of times, so I didn't graduate until I was 24. So 2014, going to college in the upper part of the US. It was a dark, snowy night, and I'm going from hanging out eating food at the student center to playing some video games on my computer in my dorm room. Now, what you have to understand is that I'm very cautious about adopting new tech fads. I didn't get a smartphone until after I graduated, for instance, because it seemed like the technology was moving too fast to be worth the abhorrent sums that they cost. But an MP3 player? That had been around since I was a teenager, and they definitely still made them at that point. And so, that was one of the few non-essential to my studies pieces of technology that I decided to purchase. There's not much storage on it, so I loaded it up with some reliable tunes that I know that I'll love. Eurythmics, Dr. Steele, Long Live the Toy Soldiers, Aerosmith, before I realized that I don't actually like Aerosmith, and about one audiobook at a time. I was big into the Dresden Files at that time. And of course, the Cranberries' greatest hits. So, like I said, it's a dark, snowy night. It's a gentle snowfall. The streetlights are just bright enough to navigate. A little bit spooky, but in a kind of romantic kind of way, I guess. All in all, I had a pretty good day, all things considered, and it was a good time in my life. I'm listening to the same song on my little MP3 player, and I'm putting my key into the door to my dorm house when I hear as if he was standing and talking directly into my right ear without there being an earbud in the way. That same voice from when I was 11. Are you still listening to this stuff? Now, I am alone. Like alone. Like there probably isn't another person out in the snow at about 10 p.m. for at least half a mile around me at least, even if I am on campus. There's nobody who could have said that, much less anything standing next to me. This isn't the first time that I'd listened to that song that day too, so it wasn't my MP3 player or anything either. I couldn't resist but laughing at the time and say, "Get lost, Mr. H, it's my tunes," and I quickly go to my room. And so, now technically I guess that I have two ghost stories to tell everyone. Back when I was in 6th grade, around 11 years old, I lived in an old apartment that always had a strange vibe. My school bus arrived early in the morning, so I was usually the first one in my house to wake up and get ready. And one morning, while brushing my teeth, I noticed something in the mirror, a black shadowy figure standing right behind me. It was only for a split second, gone before I could even process it. I brushed it off, thinking that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it started happening every single day. Each morning, in the same spot, I'd catch a glimpse of that dark figure in the mirror, only ever for a millisecond, but it was there. I convinced myself that it must just be my imagination. I was too scared to acknowledge it because I thought that if it was real and I showed fear, that it would only get worse. This continued for 2 weeks. Then, one night I woke up and I saw it again. This time not in the mirror though, but right next to my bed. It had no legs, just a dark, shadowy form. Frozen in fear, I stayed silent, but deep down I felt like it knew that I could see it. Terrified, I ran to my mother's room, desperate to tell her, but she reassured me, saying that it was nothing and that I was just imagining things. Coming from a somewhat religious family, she told me to stay calm and not to overthink it. But the figure kept reappearing. For the next few days, I tried my best to ignore it, but the fear kept building up until one night, I just couldn't take it anymore. I broke down crying and finally told my mum everything in detail. That's when she realized that something was really wrong, and without wasting any time, she took me to a temple. Things only got worse though before they got any better. I started having these terrifying nightmares about a presence that felt like a woman. In these dreams, she would whisper horrifying things, saying that she would kill me, that she wouldn't leave this place. The dreams felt so real that I even started dreading sleeping. At this point, strange things were happening in our home too. I used to play all around the house with my RC car, even going into the storeroom without a second thought. But after the shadow figure appeared, something changed. The storeroom just felt wrong, for a lack of a better term. It was always cold, heavy, and just off. I wasn't the only one who noticed it too. Everyone in my family started avoiding that room without even realizing why. And it wasn't just the eerie feeling. Around this time, my family started arguing constantly over the smallest things. The tension was unreal as well, almost like something was trying to turn us against each other. We later found out that the area that we lived in was known for dark magic practices apparently, and our building was apparently built on a British burial ground as well. And so, after realizing all of this, we didn't waste any time. We moved out as quickly as we could. But here's the strangest part. After going to the temple, the priest prayed for me and tied a holy thread around my wrist. And just like that, I never saw the shadowy figure ever again, not even once. Ever since that day, I've never experienced anything like it again. And that's my experience. My sister, though, she had a whole other level of encounters during this time. And if you guys are interested, then do let me know, because I should be able to share them with you all. This is an event that I will never forget, and there is absolutely no way that I could have mistaken this. So, me and my sister were living in a townhouse together at this time. This was about 3 to 4 years ago, We lived in a suburban town where everyone really knew everyone. The town was filled with forests and cornfields, and so when it was nighttime, it did get a little bit eerie. So it was a Friday evening, and my sister and I were fighting over the phone about something minuscule, I guess, but we both work together as well, so you can imagine how heated our arguments can get spending that much time together. Anyway, during the workday, we were going at it over text, and it had gotten to a pretty bad point where we may need to separate ourselves. As the clock hits 5 p.m., she leaves the office first. We're still texting and fighting over the phone to the point where I was almost in full-blown rage mode. I take a breather, pack my things, and head off back to the townhouse. I was contemplating going over to my parents' house, who live close by, but at that time I needed to cool down a bit and just be by myself. So as I'm driving, I am completely dreading seeing her there and having to go through yet another argument. But I get to the townhouse, I take a deep breath, and I walk towards the front door, preparing myself for another useless argument. I walk in and head to the kitchen, and thankfully she was upstairs in her room. Her room is located right above the kitchen, and I can hear clear as day a conversation she is having on the phone. And who was she talking about? You guessed it, me. She is calling me every name in the book, talking down on my character and saying downright evil things. At this point, I choose to call my mum to calm me down and tell her about the volatile situation that we're having. I need to talk to her about it in hopes that this argument can be done with. And as I'm talking to my mum, I hear her notice that I'm home, and then she directly starts screaming at me to get the F out, and starts swearing at me and just saying all these really nasty things. I was taken back by the disgusting things that she was saying. She has a very distinct voice that was just piercing through the walls. And so I snapped. I started screaming back, and we're yelling through the ceiling, and my mum is hearing me scream with rage over the phone. She is hearing me going back and forth with her. My mum then yells at me to stop, so I do. And the next words that she said, it just put pure terror straight into me. She quietly and slowly tells me, "Your sister is right next to me. She is with me right now at the house. Who are you yelling at?" And that is when I learned about mimic spirits. An evil spirit was mimicking my sister to enrage and feed off of the energy. So, pray up and be aware. I spend 6 months of the year in the fire lookout station. For privacy's sake, I'm not saying where. Alone with the trees and the sky and nothing else. I'm used to the solitude, and I like it most of the time, to be honest. Backpacking clears my head and makes me less lonely, I guess, but recently I couldn't help but wonder if I wasn't alone. The first time that I saw her, I honestly thought that I was dreaming. It was almost sunset. The light was dying, but I could still look down the trail. And that's when I saw her, standing at the edge of the woods, immobile. She was a woman, dressed in white, shining against the dark woods. I couldn't budge. I stared at her for what felt like forever, and then I blinked and she vanished. At night it rained, and the wind was howling so strongly it seemed like a hurricane had magically appeared outside. The cabin creaked and cracked, and the radio lost power, and then I got a call for help. A tiny fire a few miles down the road, apparently. We put it out, but I couldn't help but wonder if maybe the woman had started it. I tried to forget it. I maybe was just tired or hallucinating or something, and then it happened again. A week or so later, I was watching her from the tower window. She was on the ridge in the same white dress, just staring. My stomach twisted a bit, and I knew something awful was going to happen. That night, the wind came back again, and the old antenna fell over. I was alone for hours without any ability to communicate with the outside world. It's happened a few times now. I just keep seeing her, always off in the distance, always quiet. And every time something goes awry, a storm, a missing hiker, or even a bear that wanders too close. It's almost like she attracts chaos with her, like some sort of specter who brings calamity just for being there. I've tried talking to her, I've even yelled, but nothing. She just stands there. When she's around, too, the air just feels heavy, like everything is holding its breath. One night, though, it got worse. I woke up to this soft sort of tapping on the cabin door, tapping fingers, so to speak. I was already in a hurry before I got up, and I grabbed my flashlight and began walking slowly towards the door, telling myself that it must just be a branch or something. But the tappings grew louder, and I breathed deeply and opened the door, and there was nothing but the blackness. I swept the light around, but no branches, no wind, just stillness. And then I saw her. She was on the absolute edge of the porch, 10 feet from me. Her dress shone and I couldn't breathe. But her face was the worst part. It was, well, blank, smooth, no features. I instantly dropped the flashlight and it rolled, creating shadows everywhere. Out of nowhere, she screamed, and it was the worst ear-shattering scream that I think I'd ever heard. It felt like it had the power of 1,000 voices all at once. The sound was ringing in my bones, and I put my hands over my ears, but it didn't seem to make any difference. I could have sworn that my head was going to burst, and then, just as it had started, it stopped. I glanced up, and she was gone. The night was once more quiet, as if nothing whatsoever had happened. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I turned on every light and sat in the corner waiting. And I couldn't help but wonder, what if she had moved a little closer? And now, whether I'm in the woods or whether I'm at the cabin, I swear that I can feel eyes upon me. The air is icy and mere sounds make me jump. I just have music on the radio so that I don't feel so alone now. I have no idea if she's warning me or if she's bringing the bad things upon me, but one thing is for certain. I get this queasy feeling every time that I see her, and sure enough, something always goes wrong. Always. Last week, I had a horrific experience. It was the middle of the night, and I woke up to footsteps in my apartment. I immediately got up and walked around, didn't see anyone, realized that my front door was stupidly unlocked, so of course I go and lock it, do another check around the apartment, and I go back to sleep. Now, several hours later, I wake up to the same noises, but this time I stay still and just listen. The noise stops, but my bedroom door opens ever so slightly, and I can see the black outline of a person. As you can imagine, at this point I am terrified. I don't move or make a noise, and I just wait. Finally, the figure just says 0 in a human voice, and it sounded like any other man. I jump out of bed, turn on all the lights, and look around again, but there was nothing. I double-check the locks and this time lock my bedroom door. I sit in my bed for a while, waiting for, something to happen before dozing off again. In the morning, I'm still pretty freaked out, but I go and take a shower, and when I turn the water on, the water is hitting the ceiling. The shower head had somehow been turned completely upside down, and I realized the only place that I didn't check was behind the shower curtain. And I know that I wouldn't have done that. Like, why would anyone turn the shower head 180 degrees around like that? It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I go about my day, and I try not to think about it too much. Flash forward to yesterday, I get into my car in the morning to go to class, and my rearview mirror has also been turned all the way upside down. After that, I'm just so confused and spooked. I wondered if maybe I was sleepwalking and turning things upside down or something, but I've never been a sleepwalker in my 22 years, and apparently it's very rare for sleepwalkers to randomly start it in their 20s, almost unheard of in fact. Which is why I'm here. Does anyone know what the heck is going on? I'm not very well versed in the supernatural, so I'm pretty much out of my depth here. Is there some sort of a spirit that turns things upside down like this? Is it a bad omen or something? I would genuinely really appreciate people's thoughts on this. For the past 2.5 years now, I've been living in the north of the Scottish Highlands. And when I say north, I mean as far north as you can possibly go. I live in a region called Caithness, in the small coastal town of Thurso, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed a far cry from my gloomy hometown in Yorkshire, England. And when my dad and his partner told me that they'd bought an old house up there, I jumped at the opportunity. From what they told me, Caithness sounded like the perfect destination. There were seals and otters in the town's river, dolphins and orcas in the sea, and at times of the year, you could see the northern lights in the night sky even. But despite my initial excitement of finally getting to live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture, I would soon learn that the region that I had just moved to was far from the idyllic destination that I had dreamed of. So many tourists flood here each summer, but when you actually choose to live here, in a harsh and freezing coastal climate, this place feels more like a purgatory, I guess. More than that, in fact. This place actually feels cursed. This probably just sounds like superstition on my part, but what almost convinces me of this belief, more so than anything else here, is that disturbing things have washed up on shore, each one worse than the last, and they all have to do with death. The first thing that I discovered here happened maybe a couple of months after I first moved to Caithness. In my spare time, I took to exploring the coastline around the Thurso area. It was one of these days that I started to explore what was east of Thurso. On the right side of the mouth of the river, there's these old ruins of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. I first started exploring this trail with my dog, Macy, on a very windy and rainy day. We trekked down the cliff trail and onto the bedrocks by the sea, and making our way around the curve of a cliff base, we found something. Littered all over the bedrock floor were what seemed like dozens of dead seabirds, and I mean, they were everywhere. It was as though they had just fallen out of the sky and washed ashore. I just assumed that they either crashed into the rocks or were swept into the sea due to the stormy weather. Feeling like this was almost a warning, I decided to make my way back home, rather than risk being blown off the cliff trail like that. It wasn't until a day or so after, though, when I went back to explore further down the coast, that a woman with her young daughter stopped me. Shouting across the other side of the road through the heavy rain, the woman told me that she had just come from that direction, but that there was a warning sign for dog walkers, warning them that the area was infested with dead seabirds that had apparently died from bird flu. She said the warning had told dog walkers to keep their dogs on a leash at all times, as bird flu was contagious to them. This instantly concerned me, as you can imagine, as the day before my dog Macy had gotten close to the dead seabirds to sniff them. But there was something else too. Something about meeting this woman had struck me as weird. Although she was just a normal woman with her young daughter, they were walking with a dog that was completely identical to Macy, a small black and white border collie. Maybe that's why the woman was so adamant to warn me in the first place, because in my dog she saw her own, heading in the direction of danger. But why this detail was so weird to me was that it almost felt like an omen of some kind. She was leading with her dog, identical to mine, away from the contagious dead birds, as though I should have been doing the same thing. And I know this is going to sound a bit crazy, but it almost felt as though it wasn't just the woman who was warning me, but something else, something disguised as a coincidence. Curious as to what this warning sign was, I thanked the woman for letting me know, before continuing with Macy towards the trail. We reached the entrance of the castle ruins, and on the entrance gate I saw the sign that we had just been warned about. The sign was bright yellow and outlined with contagion symbols. If the woman's warning wasn't enough to make me turn around, this sign definitely was, and so I head back into town, all the while worrying that my dog might now be contagious. Thankfully, Macy would be absolutely fine. Although I would later learn that bird flu was actually common to the region, and so dead seabirds wasn't anything new. What I would stumble upon a year later, washed up on the town's beach, would definitely be far more sinister though. In the summer of the following year, like most days, I walked with Macy along the town's beach, which stretched from one end of the Thurso Bay to the other. I never really liked this beach, because it was always covered in stacks of seaweed, which not only stunk of sulfur, but attracted swarms of flies and midges and all those creepy crawlies. Even if they weren't on you, you couldn't help but feel like you were being bitten all over the body. The one thing that I did love about this beach, though, was that on a clear enough day, you could see in the distance one of the islands of Orkney. On a more cloudy or foggy day, it was as if this particular island was really never there to begin with, and all you see instead is the ocean and a false horizon. On one particular summer's day, I was walking with Macy along this beach. I had let her off her lead as she loved exploring and finding new smells from the ocean. She was rummaging through the stacks of seaweed when suddenly Macy had found something. I went to see what it was, and I realized that it was something that I had never seen before. What we found, lying on top of a layer of seaweed, was an animal skeleton. I wasn't sure what animal it belonged to exactly, but it was either a sheep or a goat. There were many farms in Caithness and across the sea in Orkney. My best guess was that an animal on one of Orkney's coastal farms must have fallen off of a ledge or a cliff, drowned, and its remains eventually washed up here. Although I was initially taken back by this skeleton, grinning up at me with its molar-like teeth, something else about this animal quickly caught my eye. The upper body was indeed skeletal remains, completely picked white clean, but the lower body was still there. It still had its hooves and all its wet fur even. The fur was dark grey, and as far as I could see, all the meat underneath was still intact. And although disturbed by this carcass, I was also very confused. What I didn't understand was, why had the upper body of this animal been completely picked off, whereas the lower part hadn't even been touched? What was weirder, though, was that the lower body hadn't even decomposed yet. In fact, it looked really fresh. I can still recollect the image of this dead animal in my mind's eye. At the time, one of the first impressions that I had of it was that it seemed almost satanic. It reminded me of the image of Baphomet, a goat's head on a man's body. What made me think this was not only the dark goat-like legs, but also the position the carcass was in. Although the carcass belonged to a goat or a sheep, the way the skeleton was positioned almost made it appear hominid. The skeleton was laid on its back, with an arm and a leg on each side of its body. However, what I also have to mention about this incident is that, like the dead seabirds and the warnings of the concerned woman, this skeleton almost felt like an omen, a bad one. I thought it might have been at that time, and to tell you the truth, it was. Not long after finding this skeleton washed up on the town's beach, my personal life suddenly takes a very dark and somewhat tragic downward spiral. I almost wish that I could go into the details of what happened, as it would only support the idea of how much of a bad omen this skeleton would turn out to be, but it's all rather personal and I really don't want to get into it. And while I've still lived in this god-forsaken place, I have come across one more thing that was washed ashore, and although I cannot say whether it was more or less disturbing than the Baphomet-like skeleton that I had found earlier, it was definitely bone-chilling. 6 or so months later, and into the Christmas season, I was still recovering from what personal things had happened to me, almost foreshadowed by the Baphomet skeleton. It was also around this time that I had just gotten out of a long-distance relationship and was only finding closure from it now. Feeling as though I had finally gotten over it, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail east of Thurso. And so, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at around 6 a.m. The hike along the trail had taken me all day, and by the evening I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found, though, was actually an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking disperse of old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually the Castletown Heritage Center, a tourist spot. It seemed that I had walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of Thurso. On the other side of this settlement were the distant cliffs of Dunar Bay, which, compared to the cliffs that I had already trekked along, were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way, and already anticipating a long journey back from the trail, I decided that I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. Considering what I would find there, this is the point in the journey where, honestly, I wish that I had stopped. By the time that I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark and I had already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs just didn't feel any closer. It was at this point when I decided that I really needed to turn around, as at night, walking back along the cliff trail was going to be pretty dangerous, and for the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. I made my way back through the abandoned settlement of the Heritage Center, and at night, this settlement definitely felt more like a ghost town. Shining my phone flashlight into the windows of the old stone houses, I was expecting to see a face or something peer out at me. What surprisingly made these houses scarier at night were a handful of old fishing boats that had been left outside of them, though. The wood that they were made from looked very old, and the paint had mostly been weathered off. But what was most concerning was that in this abandoned ghost town of a settlement, I wasn't alone. A van had pulled up, with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things into a trash can. What it was that they were burning, I didn't know. But as I made my way out of the abandoned settlement, every time I looked back at the men by the van, at least one of them was watching me. The abandoned settlement, the creepy men burning things by their van, that wasn't even the creepiest thing that I came across on that hike. The creepiest thing that I found actually came as soon as I decided to head back home, before I was even back at the Heritage Center. Finally, making my way back, I tried retracing my footprints along the beach. It was so dark by now that I needed to use my phone flashlight to find them. As I wandered through the darkness with only the dim brightness of the flashlight to guide me, I came across something. Ahead of me, I could see a dark silhouette of something in the stand. It was too far away for my flashlight to reach, but it seemed to me that it was maybe just a big rock. So I wasn't all too concerned. But for some reason, I wasn't 100% convinced either that this was actually a rock. The closer I get to it, the more I think that it could possibly be something else. I was almost right on top of it now, and the silhouette didn't look as much like a rock as I thought it did. If anything, it looked more like a very big fish, almost like a tuna fish. I didn't even realize fish could get that big, and around these waters. Still unsure whether this was just a rock or a dead fish of sorts, but too afraid to shine my light on it directly, I decided that I was going to touch it with my foot. My first thought was that I was going to feel hard rock beneath me, only to realize that the darkness had played a trick on me. I lift up my foot and press it on the dark silhouette, but what I felt wasn't hard rock. It was squidgy. My first reaction was a little bit of a shock, because if this wasn't a rock like I originally thought, then it was something else and had probably once been alive. Almost afraid to shine my light on whatever this thing was, I finally work up the courage to do so. Hoping this really is just a very big fish, I reluctantly shine my light on the dark squidgy thing. But what the light reveals is something else. It was a seal, a dead seal pup. Seal carcasses do occasionally wash up on this region, and it wasn't even the first time that I'd seen one, but as I studied the dead seal with my flashlight, feeling my skin crawl as I did it, I suddenly noticed something alarming. This seal pup had a chunk of flesh bitten out of it. For all I knew, this poor seal pup could have been hit by a boat, and that's what caused this wound. But the wound was round and basically a perfect bite shape. Depending on the time of year, there are orcas around these waters which occasionally hunt seals, but this bite mark was no bigger than what a full-grown seal could make. Did another seal do this? I know other animals will sometimes eat their young, but I've never heard of seals doing this. But what was even worse than the idea that this pup was potentially killed by its own species was that this pup, this poor little thing, was missing its skull. Not its head, just its skull. The skin was still there is what I mean, but it was empty, laying flat against the sand. Just when I think it can't get any worse than this, though, I leave the seal to continue making my way back when I come across another dark silhouette in the sand ahead. I go towards it, and what I find is another dead seal pup. But once more, this one also had an identical wound, a fatal bite mark, and just like the other one, the skull was missing. Now, I could accept that they'd been killed by either a boat or, more likely, from the evidence an attack from another animal, but how did both of these seals, with the exact same wounds in the same place, also both have their skulls missing? I didn't understand it. These seals hadn't been ripped apart. They only had one bite mark each. Would the seal or seals that killed them really remove their skulls like this? I didn't know. I still don't, to be honest, but what I do know is that both of these carcasses were identical, completely identical, which was strange. They had clearly died the same way, and I more than likely knew how they had died, but what the heck happened to their skulls? I mean, maybe one of them could lose their skulls, but could they both do this? Really? I mean, I suppose so. Growing up most of my life in Yorkshire, England, where nothing ever really happens, and suddenly moving to what seemed like the edge of the world, and finding mutilated remains of animals that you only ever saw in zoos, it definitely stays with you. For the past 2.5 years that I've been here, I almost do feel as though this region is cursed though. Not only because of what I found washed ashore, after all, dead things wash up here all the time. I almost feel like this place is cursed for a number of reasons. Despite the natural beauty all around, this place does somewhat feel like a purgatory, a depressive place that attracts lost souls from all around the UK. Many of the locals leave this place, migrating far down south to places like Glasgow. On the contrary, it seems a fair number of people like me have come from afar to live here, mostly retired English couples who, for some reason, choose this place above all others to live comfortably before the day that they die. Perhaps like me, they thought this place would be idyllic, only to find out that they were wrong. For the rest of the population, well, they're either junkies or convicted criminals, Satanists, relocated here from all around the country, and if anything, you could even say that Caithness is the UK's Alaska, where people come to get far away from their past lives or even themselves, but instead, amongst the natural beauty, are harassed by a cold, dark, and depressing climate. Maybe this place isn't actually cursed. Maybe it really is just a remote area in the far north of Scotland that has, for UK standards, a very unforgiving climate. Regardless, I won't be here for much longer. Maybe the ghost that followed me here will follow wherever I may end up next. But a fair bit of warning, if you do choose to come here, make sure that you only ever come in the summer. And whatever you do, if you have your own personal demons of any kind, whatever you do, just don't move here. So, I guess the wildest thing that I've ever experienced happened last year, and I still don't know how to explain it without sounding like I'm making it up, but here it goes. So, it started with these little things going missing. I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so I figured that I was just forgetful at first. A protein bar here, a sock there, whatever, right? But then my TV would be on different inputs than when I left. Nothing huge, but just enough to make me second guess myself. The weirdest thing though was that I'd hear these faint bumps in the ceiling sometimes. I chalked it up to raccoons or whatever. My house is old, stuff creaks, but then one night, I came home late from work and I could have sworn that I saw a shadow move past the vent opening in the hallway ceiling. I told myself that I was just tired, imagination, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. So I set up one of those cheap motion sensor cameras that I bought off Amazon, pointed it straight at the attic access panel in the hallway. 2 nights later, I got a notification at 2:17 a.m. Motion detected. I opened the clip, and instantly, my stomach dropped. There was a person climbing down from the attic, like full-on quietly stepping down the ladder, looking around and heading into my kitchen. I instantly froze. I was in this house at that time that clip was taken too. Well, as you can imagine, I called the cops immediately, locked myself in my room with a bat, freaking out while they did the full sweep. They found no one at first, but when they checked the attic, there was a little setup up there, a sleeping bag, some snacks, a small camping stove, empty water bottles. Someone had clearly been living up there. The person was my neighbor's grown son, who apparently had some drug issues and got kicked out a while back. He broke in when I was on vacation a few months earlier, and just, well, never left. He'd sneak down at night to grab food or watch TV, and he got arrested. I moved out 3 weeks later, and I still have trouble sleeping in total silence because now every creak makes me think that someone's crawling around above me. This goes back about 22 years. It's about my aunt's ex-husband. Back then, they lived near a well-known holiday spot somewhere in the mountains of India. He used to own a small shop in the town, and their house was further up along a steep road in the hills. Now one night, pretty late, around 12:30 a.m., he was heading back home from work on his scooter when the tire got punctured. Since it wasn't too far and he knew the road well, he decided to walk the rest of the way. The path was steep, no streetlights at all, but he was used to it. And while walking, he suddenly felt the temperature drop. Everything went quiet, and he got this weird sense like something was off. A few minutes later, he hears this soft cycle bell ringing behind him. He turns around to check, and no one's there. Nothing, in fact. When he turns back, there's this man, though, walking beside him. Someone who looked familiar, but he just couldn't place who it was. Even the voice sounded like someone that he knew, but he just couldn't figure it out. They kept walking together, and this guy was acting a bit strange, speaking in a low tone, kind of gulping his words. He kept asking for a cigarette again and again. Now, the ex-husband used to smoke, but for some reason he just didn't want to give him one. Something felt off about him. Then, suddenly, the guy puts his hand on his shoulder, like they're walking together as close friends. But it felt heavy, and he didn't say anything at first. They were almost near his house when he heard that cycle bell again. This time he turned quickly, but again, nothing behind. And when he turned back to the front, the guy was gone. But here's the creepy part. Even though the man had disappeared, he could still feel that heavy pressure on his shoulder, like someone's hand was still there. Freaked out, he ran the rest of the way home. My grandmother was waiting for him, and she said that he looked pale and was sweating like crazy, and apparently he just went straight to sleep without saying much. The next morning, he got up and went to take a hot shower, but the second the hot shower touched his back, he yelled. His shoulder was absolutely burning. He looked in the mirror and saw what looked like claw marks and scratches all over that shoulder, like something had actually dug into his skin. The locals believe that spirits or negative energy sometimes appear using familiar faces or voices. They try to trick you by asking for things like cigarettes or alcohol, stuff considered vices. Apparently, if you give it to them, they purposely drop it and ask you to pick it up, and that is when they strike. Either they try to possess you or they try to harm you. Another crazy detail, too, is that the place where the man vanished, well, it's just a few steps ahead and there's a small temple there. Locals believe that it's protected by a strong goddess. I can only guess that that's probably why the spirit disappeared right there. And even now, all these years later, he still has those faint scratch marks on his shoulder. This happened to me during that strange time between the first and the second COVID lockdowns. Back then, my dad was working as a manager at a banquet hall. As soon as the restrictions lifted, people rushed to get their weddings and engagements done, so he got insanely busy at the time. He used to come home really late, around 2 a.m., and leave again by 6 in the morning. Barely any rest, but one day he casually said, "Thanks for pressing my legs last night. I really needed that." Me and my mother just looked at each other, because we hadn't done anything. I mean, we were out cold the entire night. He just smiled to himself, though, and said, "Must have been my dad then." You see, he lost his father when he was really young, and he loved him deeply. He genuinely believed it was his dad looking out for him as well from the afterlife, helping him during those stressful days. This kept happening, night after night. He'd mention a feeling of a presence, a pressure on his legs, or bed shifting gently like somebody was there. But then came the night that made things unsettling. He got home super late and I was still awake, just gaming. He walked in, saw me, and just sort of lost it. "Why are you still up? You've got class tomorrow." We argued, just a typical heated back and forth, and after that we both sort of stormed off to our rooms. Now, the layout of our house was simple. Living room in the middle, my room to the left, my parents' room to the right, and if either of us stood at our door, we could see the other across the hall. I went back into my room, but I didn't sleep. I was still irritated. So instead, I just got back into gaming. Around 3:30 a.m. though, I heard the bed in my parents' room creak, then heavy footsteps coming toward my room. I panicked a bit. I quickly got under my blanket, pretending to be asleep. The footsteps, they came closer, and then they stopped, right beside my bed. I held my breath a little bit, but I could hear it. Slow, heavy breathing right next to me. It didn't leave for 15, maybe 20 minutes, and I just sort of laid there frozen. Eventually, the footsteps walked away, no creaking this time, and just silence. I must have dozed off after that, still wrapped up in fear. But the next morning, I woke up to a burning sensation on my shoulder. I checked, and there was this cut, a clean 2-inch long cut across my shoulder. No sharp objects nearby. My nails were trimmed, and really, just no explanation. When I told my dad, he didn't seem surprised. He just calmly said, "That's my dad warning you, telling you not to give me a hard time." Well, I completely freaked. Other weird stuff started happening after that too. Shadows, sounds, that same heavy breathing feeling, and it just got too much. And so we eventually decided to move out. Now it's April 25th and my dad passed away this January. And all I can hope is that he finally met his dad again, that they're together now, wherever they are, and that his soul is finally at peace.